The span of time over which religion in Egypt can be traced is unusually long, beginning with the earliest written sources around 3200 BC, and continuing until the triumph of Christianity in the 3rd century. Even at the start of this period, Egyptian religion had already reached a complex form, though it still preserved elements from earlier stages that had developed during prehistoric times. Because religion is deeply rooted in emotion, it is most clearly revealed through writing, while the material remains of culture rarely allow certain interpretation regarding their religious significance. From the Paleolithic period in Egypt, no conclusions about religious beliefs can be drawn, as the only evidence that survives are simple flint tools found on the desert plateau or washed into the Nile Valley. At that time, the deserts on either side of the Nile supported vegetation and wildlife, but as the climate grew drier, humans and animals alike retreated into the fertile valley. By the Neolithic, people had settled in permanent communities along the river. Agriculture was already practiced, though hunting still played an important role. The concentration of people into organized groups can be explained by the special conditions of the Nile Valley. The fertile soil required irrigation and protection, and such works demanded the cooperation of the entire community. Both Upper and Lower Egypt were occupied during the Neolithic, though archaeological research has primarily focused on Upper Egypt, since the remains of Lower Egypt are now buried under deep layers of Nile silt. In Upper Egypt, 3 cultural phases have been identified, named after the sites where they were first studied: the Thasian, the Badarian, and the Nagadian. Each differs in age as well as in pottery and tools. In Lower Egypt, the settlement at Merimde Benisalame appears to be contemporary with the Thasian, but shows a distinct culture, while the finds at Madi, dating to the Middle or later Nagadean, suggest that by then a shared material culture had developed across both regions. The strongest evidence for religious beliefs in this period comes from cemeteries. Graves contained vessels with food and drink, tools, weapons, and simple ornaments, showing that people believed these items were necessary for the dead in an afterlife that was imagined as a continuation of earthly existence. Preservation of the body was left to the natural dryness of the sand and climate, though in the Badarian period corpses were sometimes wrapped in animal skins, probably reflecting everyday clothing. To protect the bodies from scavengers, they were covered with mats, large pots, wooden cases, or coffins. At Merimst, the dead were not buried in cemeteries, but within the settlement itself, sometimes inside houses near the hearth. This may have symbolized the need for warmth, or suggested that the deceased continued as members of the community. In the Badarian period, the earliest graves were near villages, but later cemeteries were located farther away, hinting at a growing separation between the worlds of the living and the dead. A striking feature of prehistoric burials is the contracted position of the bodies, a custom shared widely across Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. The spine was curved, legs bent, and hands placed before the face. Scholars have debated the meaning of this practice. It may have been intended to save space in the grave, but more likely it symbolized the posture of sleep. If so, this would suggest that death was conceived as a form of rest, a welcome release for people accustomed to lives of hard labor. The position must have been arranged soon after death, and it is even possible that the early Egyptians followed a practice similar to some African tribes who contract the bodies of their dead at the moment of death. This explanation could also account for the less common occurrence of fully extended bodies in prehistoric burials, as these may represent individuals discovered too late for the contraction to be performed. The usual burial position in early Egypt placed the body on its left side, a custom maintained from the Badarian period through the Nagada era into the first dynasties, and even as late as the Middle Kingdom. The pyramid texts reflect this practice, describing the dead king as lying on his left side and being called upon to turn over to receive offerings. However, variations existed. At Merim de Benisalame, most bodies rested on the right side, and at El Amra in Upper Egypt, this orientation was also common. Graves were typically aligned along a north-south axis, following the course of the Nile, with the head placed to the south so the face turned west. This westward orientation corresponded with the idea of the afterlife lying in the land of the setting sun. Yet, there were exceptions. At Merim de Benisalame, bodies often faced north or northeast, while at El Amra and later at Gerdza and Tura, many faced east. These differences raise the question of whether orientation reflected changing beliefs. In later times, the West became firmly established as the land of the dead, but the East, as the place of sunrise, could also have symbolized renewal and rebirth. The North may have been significant as well, since early texts speak of souls dwelling among the imperishable stars of the northern sky, suggesting that such beliefs may have very ancient roots. Pottery from the mid-Nagada period provides further insight. Painted scenes show boats with deck cabins, probably linked with funerary rituals. On the cabins were tall poles bearing various symbols or animals, often with ribbons fluttering down. Some of these emblems can be identified. Palm branches, mountain shapes, the sun, the emblem later associated with Min, elephants, birds, goats, and gazelles, while many remain uncertain. These standards likely represented the symbols of local deities, anticipating the divine emblems carried on poles in later times. The great variety of symbols fits well with the diverse religious landscape of Egypt, where numerous local gods were worshipped, many of which disappeared over time as others grew dominant. Although archaeology offers limited clarity on prehistoric religion, some themes emerge. Funerary customs already reflected a belief in life after death. Animal cults also reached back into remote antiquity, as shown by carefully buried remains of jackals, bulls, rams, and gazelles from the Badarian culture. By the close of prehistory, ceremonial palettes and mace heads provide vivid depictions of ritual and conflict, with divine standards occupying prominent positions. One palette shows hunters carrying ensigns topped with falcons and other symbols during a lion hunt. Another depicts a battlefield strewn with corpses, where falcon and ibis standards extend human arms grasping prisoners. On another fragment recording the destruction of towns, 5 standards, bearing jackals, an ibis, a falcon, and Min's emblem, also end in hands holding ropes, almost certainly binding captives. The same imagery continues into the early dynastic period. On the great mace head of King Scorpion, standards adorned with bows and dead birds appear in an agricultural ritual, while on the famous palette of King Narmer, an identical set of 4 standards is carried before the ruler. These include figures of a jackal, 2 falcons, and an oval emblem resembling that later linked with Khans. Since Narmer is generally identified with Menes, the founder of the first dynasty, these objects may record the historic unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under one sovereign, with divine symbols serving as witnesses and legitimizers of this transformation. The same divine standards that once accompanied kings in early processions continued to appear throughout Egyptian history, especially during festivals. Even in the 3rd century AD, the writer Clement of Alexandria noted that Egyptians still carried golden emblems of 2 dogs, a hawk, and an ibis in their sacred celebrations. Inscriptions on temple reliefs make it clear that these standards were linked to particular deities, serving as their emblems, and were carried not only in rituals, but also on hunts and into battles. In later times, similar standards were used as symbols to designate the nomes, the administrative districts of Egypt. The Greeks called them nomoi, and their number varied slightly over time, though tradition fixed 22 in Upper Egypt and 20 in Lower Egypt. These nomes were essentially the remnants of prehistoric city-states that had once been independent before being drawn together into the 2 kingdoms. In hieroglyphs, the names of these nomes were nearly always written with standards, the earliest clear example dating back to the reign of King Djoser in the 3rd dynasty. In the prehistoric era, religion and politics were closely tied to local identity. Each town had its own deity, represented through a sacred animal or object, and this figure was regarded as the local lord. Over time, as some towns gained greater political and economic strength, their gods overshadowed or absorbed the deities of less important places. In some cases, deities with similar characteristics merged into one. This system of local gods was essentially a form of early fetishism, in which sacred power was attached to a tangible emblem. The practice of placing divine emblems on poles with ribbons eventually gave rise to the hieroglyphic sign for God or divine. Early forms of this sign were sometimes mistaken for an axe, but careful examination of painted examples shows its true origin in the pole and ribbons of prehistoric standards. The word for God, pronounced nutcher, survived into Coptic as newt, and was even used to denote the Christian God in early translations of the Bible. Among the earliest deities represented by animal or object fetishes were those linked with powerful creatures of the wild. Lions and bulls, admired for their strength and ferocity, appeared on ceremonial palettes and as symbols of kingship and divine power. The lioness, rather than the lion, was revered as a goddess under various names, as Mehet at This, Peket in the region of Speos Artemidos, and Matit in the 12th nome of Upper Egypt. The wild bull appears on nome standards, though its cult is less clearly documented, while the hippopotamus is known only from later evidence. Crocodile worship, however, is attested from early times at sites like Gebelein, Dendera, and Sais, later flourishing especially in the Fayum. This crocodile god was known as Sobek. The baboon was also a sacred animal from the beginning of Egyptian history. Numerous small statuettes and early depictions suggest its cult was ancient, perhaps centered at Hermopolis before being linked with the ibis of Thoth. In later texts, the baboon god was called Hedgwer, the Great White One. The cult of Set originated in Ombos, a settlement in the 5th nome of Upper Egypt. Early depictions show his animal with long legs, broad ears, and a short tail, resembling a donkey. Over time, the image became stylized into a mythical beast with squared ears, a long neck, and a curved snout, unlike any real animal. Set rose in prominence with the foundation of the 1st dynasty, becoming Lord of Upper Egypt and a powerful counterpart to Horus, with their rivalry shaping much of later mythology. Other cult animals included the oryx antelope, worshipped in the 16th nome of Upper Egypt, though its cult was soon replaced by the falcon of Horus, whose symbol would become one of the most enduring in Egyptian religion. Through these early practices, Egyptian religion reveals its deeply local origins. A land of many gods, each tied to a town or region, with their emblems carried on standards that expressed both religious devotion and political identity. Dogs were domesticated in Egypt from a very early period, and because of their usefulness in hunting, different species of canines were adopted as sacred animals in various cults, though ancient depictions do not always clearly distinguish between them. One of the most prominent canine gods was Upuaut, known as the Opener of the Ways, whose cult center was Siut. His role as a scout and guide is reflected in his name, and it is possible that his original title was an epithet of the older god Sed, with whom he was closely associated. Upuaut's emblem was carried before kings, in battle and victory processions from late prehistoric times onward. The Greeks associated him with a wolf, but he may have been closer to a wild dog, and ancient accounts describe him as such. Another important canine deity was Anubis, called Anupu in Egyptian, and better known by his Greek name. His cult was centered in the 17th nome of Upper Egypt, whose capital was later called Sinopolis, City of Dogs. Anubis was always shown as a reclining dog, sometimes with an ostrich feather on his back, and from the earliest times was regarded as a guardian of the dead and protector of burials. His association with tombs likely derived from the behavior of dogs that dug up graves in search of bones, so his worship may have been an attempt to win his favor. Another funerary canine deity was Khenti Amentiu, foremost of the Westerners, originally venerated at Abydos, who was later absorbed into the cult of Osiris. In addition, evidence from the 4th dynasty shows yet another dog or jackal god depicted in mummified form, though his name and cult center are unknown. Alongside the canine cults, there was the cat or mongoose goddess Mafdet, Lady of the House of Life, mentioned as early as the 1st dynasty. She was invoked as a protector against snakes, since both cats and mongooses were fearless killers of serpents. The original center of her cult has not been identified. Another significant figure was the vulture goddess Nekbet, based in El Kab, who became the protective deity of Upper Egypt in pre-dynastic times. Another vulture goddess, Mut of Thebes, did not rise to prominence until the Middle Kingdom. The falcon god Horus, called Horu, meaning the lofty one, was one of the most important deities of early Egypt. He was worshipped in many places, but his strongest association was with Hierakonpolis, the capital of pre-dynastic Upper Egypt. By the start of the historical period, Horus was firmly linked to the kingship, and the rulers of Upper Egypt were identified with him. He was a sky god, sometimes depicted traveling across the heavens in a boat. Another important cult center of Horus was Bedet, Edfu, and falcon deities from other locations, such as Athribis, Hebenu, and others, were later assimilated to him. Pairs of falcons were honored at Koptos and Aphroditopolis, and a northern Horus is mentioned as early as the 4th dynasty. The ibis was another sacred bird, connected with the god Thoth, whose cult dates back to the 1st dynasty. His standard appears on early palettes, suggesting Upper Egyptian origins, though Hermopolis later became his chief center. Another key figure was the cobra goddess Wadjet, worshipped at Buto in Lower Egypt, who became the protective deity of the northern kingdom. The frog goddess Heket, venerated at Antinopolis, was associated with fertility and reproduction, reflecting the mysterious life cycle of frogs. Fish cults were less common, though a fish god named Neres or Neser is known from the early dynasties, and a dolphin standard from the 16th nome of Lower Egypt points to the worship of a fish goddess called Hatmehit from the Middle Kingdom onward. Domestic animals also played a strong role in Egyptian religion. Bulls and rams were revered for their fertility, and cows for their nurturing qualities. The bull Hapi, known to the Greeks as Apis, was worshipped at Memphis from the first dynasty. Another sacred bull, Menevis, was honored at Heliopolis. Other bull cults are mentioned in early records, including a great black bull and an anointed bull, though some appear to have had only local significance. Cow goddesses were honored in several nomes and were eventually merged with Hathor of Dendera, who came to dominate this role. Ram cults also appear early. Khnum of Elephantine, the Ram of Mendes, and Harsaphis of Heracleopolis Magna are the most notable. They were usually shown as living rams of the native Egyptian species, which later disappeared in the Middle Kingdom. The ram form of Amun, appearing later, belonged to a new breed with curved horns. Finally, the cat goddess Bastet, known from the Second Dynasty, was associated with Bubastis in Lower Egypt. Though later worshipped as a domestic cat, her earliest form may have been closer to a lioness, reflecting the strength and ferocity of wild felines before the gentler household image took hold. Plant-centered worship is uncommon even in the earliest phases we can trace, though scattered clues show it once had a place. Two Upper Egyptian gnome emblems display trees mounted atop their poles. One may be an oleander, yet the species are uncertain. Certain prominent trees were treated as divine dwellings. A sycamore near Memphis on the desert edge was thought to shelter a benevolent goddess who, identified already in the Old Kingdom with Hathor as Lady of the Sycamore, shook down water and food for souls of the dead, imagined as birds arriving from the nearby necropolis. Other plants were linked to deities and held sacred without being treated as the gods themselves. Far more numerous were lifeless objects regarded as divine seats. In principle, anything bound to a temple or the person of the king could be God. This object cult is very old in Egypt, so old that the original nature of some fetishes was forgotten even by the ancients. At Heliopolis, a sacred pillar gave the city its name, Yunu, and a benben stone, later an obelisk form, was revered as the place where the rising sun alighted. The Jed, a bundled post of truncated plant stems, received offerings and priests and only later became Osirian, though at first it represented no single god. A wooden column topped with a papyrus blossom and twin feathers served as the fetish of the god Uk at Kusai. It likely began as an object attached to Hathor's local cult. Scepters and staffs, insignia of authority, were themselves cult objects. The Sekhem embodied power, its name even means power, and divine scepters were worshipped. At Abydos, Osiris was also personified by a Sekhem, whose upper part was sheathed in gold with a human face and plumes, later interpreted as the buried head of Osiris. The goddess Uyamut wielded a crook-like staff with a twisted lower end, surmounted by curved ribs and a feather, a refined version of a herdsman's stick. Even the king's ceremonial beard was personified as Dua-ware, Great Mourning One, by the First Dynasty. Neith manifested as two crossed arrows over a shield and is among the oldest deities known. Originating at Sai, her cult spread south after unification. A star on a pole with a curved crest marked Seshat. An emblem of three-peaked hills identified Ha, god of the Libyan desert. The curious fetish of Imyut consisted of a pole with a suspended, inflated animal skin. By the Middle Kingdom, it was linked with Anubis. The sign of Min appears from pre-dynastic times with shifting form and obscure function, early versions recalling a carved bone or wooden double-pointed object. As in many cultures, Egyptian gods gradually shifted from animal and object forms to human ones. This change reflects growing mastery over the natural world and a rising valuation of intellect over raw animal vigor or instinct. Beings endowed with supreme power and wisdom naturally took on human shape. The process did not occur everywhere or all at once. Elites may have favored anthropomorphic conceptions, while rural communities retained older zoomorphic or fetish ideas. Evidence suggests the shift started in prehistory. On Narmer's palette, a human-faced divinity with cow horns, likely Hathor, appears. 3 large statues of Min from Coptos, probably very early, show him nude, ithyphallic, legs fused, arms tight to the sides, the right fist once gripping his whip. Their bodies carry carved animals, including red sea fish and shells, and the distinctive sign later used to write Min's name. A 1st dynasty annal notes the modeling of Min, and by the 5th dynasty his name is written with a human figure brandishing the whip. Under Peribsen in the 2nd dynasty, Wadjet is shown in full human form, and Ash appears sometimes fully human and sometimes with hawk or set animal heads. Gods carved for Djoser's Heliopolis temple in the 3rd dynasty are wholly anthropomorphic. Royal ideology accelerated this shift. From pre-dynastic times, the king was Horus, and the falcon on a standard functioned in writing as the generic divine determinative into the Old Kingdom, only later replaced by a seated, bearded figure. Egyptian tradition rarely discarded older notions. Instead, it layered and fused them. Thus, many gods gained human bodies, but kept the animal heads of their earlier manifestations, the join artfully hidden by the headdress. Horus bears a falcon's head, Anubis a canine head, Khnum a ram's. Hathor takes a human face crowned with cow horns and sun disk. Mafdet appears human, but wears the skin of her feline. Hatmehit is human with a fish upon her head. Deities once embodied by objects became human figures wearing their fetishes as head emblems, as with Nith's shield and arrows, or Seshat's star. A few gods are always wholly human-headed: Min of Coptos, Ptah of Memphis, Atum of Heliopolis, Amun of Thebes, implying they crystallized at a relatively late prehistoric stage. Concrete images support the antiquity of Min and Ptah. Min's statues and writing from the 1st dynasty, and Ptah's figure on an alabaster bowl from Tarkhan of roughly the same era. Atum is securely attested in the Old Kingdom. Amun only rises in the Middle Kingdom. Their iconography also preserves history. Atum, Amun, and the animal-headed gods stride as living beings, while Min and Ptah remain shown as statues on pedestals, legs fused and arms close, reflecting early sculptural limits. Osiris alone often shares this rigid, statue-like form, a telling sign of his ancient roots despite his late textual debut. The djed in a 1st dynasty tomb cannot by itself prove Osiris's antiquity, because the pillar's Osirian association is later. The fortunes of individual deities in Egypt shifted over time, with some fading into obscurity, others rising to prominence, and still others altering in character. These changes were closely tied to the political evolution of the land. As independent local communities were absorbed into nomes, then grouped into Upper and Lower Egypt, and eventually united under one crown, their gods were also drawn together. The deity of a nome's capital became preeminent over lesser local gods, while the god of the capital of the whole kingdom took precedence over all others. As a result, certain gods were overshadowed or merged into stronger ones, their names disappearing or surviving only as epithets. For example, Ptah of Memphis absorbed Sokar, the cemetery god of a nearby area, and from then on often appeared as Ptah-Sokar. In other cases, priests and worshippers tried to preserve the individuality of local gods by presenting them as different forms of stronger deities. One common strategy was to incorporate old gods into divine families. A local goddess might be cast as the wife of a major god, and together they could be joined by a son. Thus, at Antinopolis, the frog goddess Heket was paired with Khnum, the ram god, and at Memphis, Ptah was given the lion goddess Sekhmet as consort, with Nefertem as their son. The unification of Egypt was accomplished under a ruler from Hierakonpolis, whose falcon god, Horus, became the embodiment of kingship. The king bore not only his personal name but also a Horus name, marking him as the living form of Horus. Horus thus rose as the national deity, yet other cults could not be ignored. Thoth of Hermopolis always retained high status, while Setek of Ombos, claiming the title Lord of Upper Egypt, became Horus's great rival. This rivalry was reflected in royal titulary. From the first dynasty, kings could embody both Horus and Setek. Under King Peribsen of the second dynasty, the Horus name was even replaced with a Setek name, though later rulers returned to the Horus name. The conflict between the two gods eventually found mythological form in the rivalry of Setek with Osiris and Horus. The original homeland of Horus remains debated. Some scholars argue he was one among many falcon gods, spread across both Upper and Lower Egypt, and that his cult was Upper Egyptian. Others suggest he was first the national god of a Lower Egyptian kingdom with its capital at Pe, later Buto, and that when this kingdom conquered Upper Egypt, Horus was transplanted to Edfu, Bedet. According to this view, Horus was Lower Egyptian in origin, and both halves of the country worshipped him after the split into two kingdoms. Horus of Behdet later became especially prominent, but not until the Third Dynasty. He is absent from the pyramid texts of the Fifth Dynasty. For now, the details of his early rise remain uncertain. After unification, King Menes established Memphis as the capital. Its god Ptah, already highly regarded, secured a lasting role as one of Egypt's chief deities, maintaining his distinct character without being fully merged into another cult. Nearby, Heliopolis was the center of the sun god Ra, worshipped not as an animal or a person, but as the solar disk itself. This cult had gained strength in Lower Egypt before the First Dynasty and deeply influenced kingship. Upper Egyptian rulers, originally tied to Horus, came under Heliopolitan solar traditions, and a fusion occurred in the form of Re-Harakte, Horus of the horizon. From then on, kings were no longer simply identified with Horus, but were proclaimed sons of Re. The exact moment of this change is difficult to pinpoint. The Second Dynasty king, Reneb, bore a name perhaps meaning Re is Lord, and Djoser of the Third Dynasty carried the title the Golden Re, suggesting identification with the sun god rather than descent from him. Yet only later did the formula son of Re become standard. It first appears under kings such as Khafra and Menkaure of the Fourth Dynasty, and from the Sixth Dynasty onward, all rulers bore it as part of their titulary, placing their birth name after the title to show they were born of Re. Many rulers also adopted names incorporating Re, either at birth or upon accession, such as Jedefre. A later tale claimed the kings of the Fifth Dynasty were literal sons of Re and a priest's wife, reflecting the triumph of the Heliopolitan cult in that era. Most Fifth Dynasty rulers built temples for Re after the Heliopolis model, embedding the solar god into state religion. Although his dominance waned somewhat afterwards, the solar cult left a permanent mark, with many local gods reinterpreted as aspects of Ra. In early depictions, Horus of Bedet still appeared as a distinct falcon hovering above the king, but in later imagery, this role was taken over by the winged solar disk, whose outstretched wings symbolized the unification and protection of Upper and Lower Egypt. This disk was regarded as the king himself, embodied in the sun, and bore the title Great God, just like the ruler. Such imagery illustrates the complete merging of Ra, Horus, and the king into a single concept. At the same time, the solar cult of Heliopolis reached an accommodation with another powerful and rising religion, that of Osiris. Originating from Jeddu, the capital of the ninth nome of Lower Egypt, Osiris was known as Lord of Jeddu. The earlier local deity of that town, Anjeti, who appeared as a human ruler with scepter, whip, and feathered crown, was gradually absorbed into Osiris, his name reduced to little more than an epithet. Both Anjeti and Osiris shared a human form, but while Anjeti represented a living ruler, Osiris always appeared as a dead one, wrapped in a royal shroud and holding regalia. His Greek name, Osiris, reflects the original Egyptian Usire, likely meaning seat of the eye, which resembles a human name. This suggests that Osiris may have originated as a mortal king who, after death, was elevated to divine status. His myth focused not on his reign in life, but on his death, dismemberment, and resurrection, after which he ruled the underworld. Egyptian texts often allude to this myth, and although our most detailed account comes from Plutarch, the essential themes agree with native tradition. Osiris's wife and sister was Isis, whose name means Siat, essentially personifying his throne. His other sister, Nephthys, may have been devised as a counterpart to her husband Setek, Osiris's brother and murderer. According to one version of the myth, Osiris was slain at a place called Nedit, where his body was cut into pieces and cast into the Nile. Another version states he was drowned. In both cases, magic restored him to life. His connection with the Nile and vegetation reflected his role as a nature god, tied to the river's flood and the fertility it brought. Yet his enduring character was that of a dead ruler, and from the 5th dynasty onward, deceased kings were identified with him. After the fall of the Old Kingdom, this royal privilege extended to the wider elite, and by the Middle Kingdom, all Egyptians, men and women alike, could be addressed as Osiris, name after death. In Upper Egypt, Abydos became the central site of his worship, eventually replacing the older funerary god Khenti Amentiu. The tomb of King Jer from the 1st dynasty was even claimed to be the resting place of Osiris, while many towns throughout Egypt asserted that particular body parts of the god had been buried within their boundaries. Since Osiris had shed any purely local identity, his cult spread freely across the land. He did not rival other gods, for he belonged solely to the realm of the dead, while his son, Horus, embodied in the reigning king, was associated with the living. In the aftermath of political upheaval, the rulers of Armant, south of Thebes, unified Egypt and founded the 11th dynasty. Their local god, Mont, rose to prominence as a war deity, reflecting the military nature of their success. Later, however, a Theban official named Amenemhet seized power and established the 12th dynasty. He and his successors promoted a previously minor Theban god, Amun. This deity had originally come from Hermopolis, where he and his consort Amunet formed part of a group of 8 primordial beings representing the endless waters and their qualities. Brought to Thebes, Amun was reshaped into a national god suitable for the whole of Egypt. He was declared chief of the gods, and elements of other powerful deities were woven into his character. Ptah of Memphis, Re of Heliopolis, and Min of Coptos. Through this process, Amun emerged as a supreme, composite figure at the heart of Egyptian religion. Under Amenemhet I and his successors, Amun might have risen swiftly to the supreme role envisioned for him by the rulers who reunited the country, had the kings not shifted their capital far to the north, near the entrance to the Fayum. By focusing on the cultivation of that region, they elevated the significance of the local god Sobek, along with the deities of Memphis and Heliopolis, thereby limiting Amun's immediate influence, even though he had already gained the title Lord of the Thrones of the Two Lands. Amun's true rise to supremacy came later, with the triumph of the Theban 18th dynasty over the Hyksos and their subsequent expansion into Asia. During this period, his former rival Re was united with him in the form of Amun-Re. It was under this name, and with his perceived support, that the kings built their empire, making Amun-Re the supreme deity and the acknowledged king of the gods. Monumental temples were erected in his honor at Karnak and Luxor, richly endowed with wealth from foreign tribute. From that time onward, his dominant position was firmly established and maintained until Egypt ceased to exist as an independent power. In the earlier discussion, we traced the gradual appearance of many Egyptian gods from the shadows of prehistory into the light of written records. Each was distinguished by name, by the festivals held in their honor, and by the towns or regions where their worship first arose, connections that in many cases endured throughout Egyptian history. Beyond these external traits, however, defining their precise nature is challenging, since sources from the Old Kingdom provide little clarity, and much of what can be said relies on later documents. Still, by the close of the 5th dynasty, the pyramid texts already offered valuable insights. It is misleading to look for a single, coherent system of belief shared across the land, for such uniformity never existed. Egyptian religion was not the product of one guiding hand, but grew out of local traditions, politics, and culture. No central authority ever completely erased local gods or fused them into a fully unified theology. At times, powerful cities or regions did manage to spread their cults beyond their borders, but this did not mean local traditions disappeared. Instead, old gods were usually reinterpreted as forms or aspects of the new ones, or as contained within them. These identifications were often vague, and the Egyptians, who were not inclined to strict logical consistency, did not seek precise definitions of such relationships. It would also be unfair to assume, as outsiders like the Greeks later did, that Egyptians literally worshipped animals or objects as divine beings. What the Egyptians revered was not the creature or object itself, but the invisible power it embodied. A visible, tangible symbol was simply the most effective way to approach and represent this abstract force. For the educated classes, these forms were understood as personifications, though ordinary people may have taken them more literally. Art, which played a central role in Egypt, also encouraged the use of animal heads on divine figures, both as a way of making distinctions between gods and as a reminder of the qualities associated with each animal. All evidence suggests that Egyptian gods were native in origin. Their names are rooted in the Egyptian language, and no convincing proof has ever been offered for foreign origins. They remained national deities until political expansion spread their cults abroad into Nubia, Sudan, Palestine, and Syria. Yet even then, they were tied to Egypt itself, for when Egyptians spoke of earth or men in relation to their gods, they meant their own land and people. There is no record of Egyptians forcing their religion on their fellow countrymen or on foreigners, nor of them preaching it as the only true faith. Their gods might aid the king in battle or conquest, but Egyptian belief was not imposed. This tolerance shaped their attitude both at home and abroad. Within Egypt, they accepted that each town had its own deity, and when they encountered foreign gods, they often saw them simply as different names or forms of their own. As a result, heresy did not arise, with the sole exception of the short-lived experiment under Akhenaten, when force was unusually used both to impose a new cult and later to suppress it. For Egyptians, the natural world on which life depended was filled with divine powers: the earth, sky, air, sun, moon, and especially the Nile. These forces, given human traits, became the great cosmic deities, present everywhere and not bound to one place. They did not always require temples or organized worship. Myths grew up around them, portraying them with human emotions and flaws, reflecting the Egyptians' tendency to explain the world in familiar human terms. While only a few complete myths survive from relatively late times, countless references in earlier texts prove that such stories flourished by the end of the 5th dynasty. The Egyptians did not think the world and the gods had existed forever. Repetition of natural cycles suggested great antiquity, but reason demanded that there must once have been a first time when everything began, when sky and earth, gods and men, Nile and air all came into being. Theories about this origin varied, and different centers of learning offered their own explanations. Of these, the most influential were the cosmogonies of Hermopolis, Heliopolis, and Memphis. According to the teachings of Hermopolis, the universe began in chaos, imagined as primordial waters known as Nun, described as the Old One who existed first. This chaos was defined by boundlessness, darkness, depth, and invisibility, each embodied by a pair of deities, male and female: Nun and Nonet, Ha and Hauhet, Kuk and Kauket, Amun and Amenet. From these 8 gods, the city took its name, Kmun, the town of 8. Yet this system alone did not explain the act of creation, for during the first intermediate period, it merged with the theology of Heliopolis, which provided the rest of the narrative. In Heliopolitan belief, Atum arose from the waters, either standing on or as a primeval mound. By his own action, he produced Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. From this pair came other gods, giving rise to the ordered world. Atum, whose name may mean the complete one, was self-created, eternal, and sovereign over the rest of the divine beings. Shu, as the god of air, represented the vital force of breath and wind, filling the space between earth and sky. He lifted up his daughter, the sky goddess Nut, and separated her from Geb, the earth god, who lay beneath him. Questions of precedence troubled Egyptian theologians. Was Nun the oldest, or Atum, or Shu? One solution was to see Atum as eternally present within Nun, with Shu born alongside him, all 3 of one essence. Eventually, the unnatural act of Atum's creation of Shu was replaced by the idea that Shu had been breathed out, consistent with his nature as air. Since Atum was already identified with the sun god Re, the combined deity Re-Atum symbolized light emerging from the watery chaos. Hermopolis claimed that its own sacred precinct was the first place where land rose above the waters. Within its walls stood a lake called the Lake of the Two Knives, representing Nun, and in it an island with a hill known as the Island of Flames, where light first shone. This idea clearly reflected the annual Nile flood, when the waters receded and dry land reappeared. Similar primeval mounds were recognized elsewhere. At Heliopolis, where a conical stone, precursor of the obelisk, marked the spot where Atum first appeared, sometimes in the form of a phoenix. At Memphis, where the land itself was personified as the god Tachinen, the rising earth. And at Thebes, where a mound was imagined within the temple at Medinet Habu. During the time when Memphis was the capital, between the 3rd and 5th dynasties, theologians sought to reconcile the Heliopolitan tradition with the Memphite belief that Ptah was the supreme creator. They taught that all the gods, from Nun down to Nefertem, including Atum himself, existed within Ptah, who embodied their forms. Atum was seen as Ptah's heart and tongue, corresponding to the divine powers of Horus and Thoth. Thus, creation was said to occur through the heart, which conceived thought, and the tongue, which uttered the creative word. The other gods were seen as Ptah's lips and teeth, shaping the world just as Atum's seed and fingers had once done. In this account, all existence was brought forth by Ptah's thought and speech. Every divine action, every natural process, and every moral distinction between right and wrong was set in motion by this union of mind and word. Life was granted to those who acted justly, while death awaited those who did evil. This theology emphasized a sophisticated understanding of the body, recognizing that the heart governed thought and the tongue gave form to its commands. Eyes, ears, and nose sent their reports to the heart, which then formed ideas, while the tongue expressed them as speech, turning thought into action. Movement of the body, work of the hands, and all human activity flowed from this interaction. Thus, the Memphite doctrine described creation in highly intellectual terms, portraying Ptah as the supreme power whose heart and tongue, symbolizing thought and command, brought forth the world and encompassed the essence of all other gods. 2,000 years after its original composition, this theological text was still regarded as so significant that the Kushite king Shabaka ordered it to be copied from a damaged papyrus onto a black basalt slab, ensuring its preservation. Few works of such antiquity in human history can be compared to it in scope and depth. Because humans were made by the gods, they were thought to contain something divine, and in some cases, they could even become gods themselves after death. While the king was recognized as divine during his lifetime, other mortals could only reach this state after passing on. Several high officials gained such honors. Khagemni at the close of the Old Kingdom was revered at Memphis, where followers clustered their tombs around his. Isi, another vizier, was honored centuries later at Edfu, where devotees called him the living god. Even more famous were Imhotep, the vizier and architect of King Djoser, and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, advisor to King Amenhotep III. Both were deified long after their deaths, continuing to be worshipped into the Ptolemaic period. Imhotep, in particular, became linked with wisdom and medicine, identified by the Greeks with Asclepios, while in Egypt he was regarded as a patron of scribes. The Egyptians also believed the primordial waters of Nun still surrounded the world. The earth itself was imagined as a flat disk floating on these waters, encircled by seas and bordered by high mountains upon which the sky rested. The heavens were personified as the goddess Nut, arching over the world, while beneath the earth lay another sky mirrored below. The underworld was called Duat, where the sun traveled during the night. Each morning the sun emerged between two mountains in the east, beginning its daily voyage across the sky in a bark known as the Manjet. The sun was most often represented as a glowing red disk, sometimes containing the god himself in human form or with a ram's head, and at other times shown as a disk carried by a scarab beetle. The scarab, rolling its ball of dung that concealed its eggs, symbolized new life and became a powerful emblem of the rising sun. The god Khepri, derived from the word Kheper, meaning to come into existence, embodied this idea of perpetual renewal, reflecting the belief that the sun was reborn each day, just as it had been at the dawn of creation. The sun god was imagined as traveling across the sky each day in his boat, accompanied by various deities who acted as his crew. Among them were Geb, Thoth, and personifications of his own powers, such as magic, Heka, perception, and commanding speech. At sunset, he left the day boat and entered the night boat, known as the Messiket. Sometimes he was shown as a disk passed from the goddess of the east into the hands of the goddess of the west, who placed him in the night vessel. Through the hours of darkness, he continued his journey beneath the earth, illuminating the realm of the dead, before rising once more in the east at dawn. Other traditions described the sun as a child who, at dusk, was swallowed by the sky goddess Nut, only to be born again from her body the following morning. Sometimes he was envisioned as a calf of the celestial cow, nurtured by the heavens. These ideas often merged, and it is not unusual to find depictions in which the anthropomorphic sun god sails his day boat across the belly of the heavenly cow. A similar notion was applied to the stars. They were described as piglets swallowed by the sow-like nut at daybreak and born again at night, which explains why the Egyptian word for evening, mesut, literally means time of birth. The stars themselves were divine beings and were divided into two groups. The circumpolar stars, which never disappear from the sky, were called those who never set, while the rest, which rise and set, were those who never grow weary. Both groups were believed to serve as crews for the solar bark, the first during the day when they are invisible, and the second during the night, as they vanish one by one into the west to accompany the sun through the underworld. The role of the moon in this cosmology was sometimes explained by identifying it with Thoth, who served as the deputy of the sun by night, earning titles such as Re who shines in the night and Reckoner of time. Later, when the universe itself was conceived as one great deity, the sun and moon became his two eyes, the sun as the right, the moon as the left. Thoth's importance reflects his early role in dividing time into months by observing lunar phases, though later the solar year proved more precise for practical use. Still, the moon's changes continued to regulate festivals and sacred observances. Another vision of the cosmos spoke of a universal sky god known as Wer, the Great One, often equated with Horus. His two eyes were the sun and moon, and he bore the title, He whose forehead holds the two eyes. When both lights were absent, as on moonless nights or during an eclipse, he was called He whose forehead has no eyes. In this form, he became the protector of the blind, healer of eye ailments, and even patron of blind musicians, sometimes depicted as a harp-playing deity. This development illustrates how grand cosmic gods were often reshaped by popular imagination into more personal figures. The natural world was likewise understood as part of divine substance. The waters of the Nile were seen as flowing from Nun, or as the limbs, or even the sweat of Osiris. The air could be called the limbs of Amun, while metals like flint and iron were thought to come from the body of Setek. Even incense was literally divine fragrance. Human life was believed to be governed by destiny, or Shoi, determined at birth by 7 Hathor goddesses. Fate could be harmful, dictating misfortune or death, or it could be favorable, personified as Renenet, the nursing goddess who ensured nourishment and fortune. Over time, she was merged with Ernutet, a cobra goddess associated with the harvest, since crops formed the foundation of wealth. Yet destiny was not entirely fixed. A person could influence it by effort and action, though ultimately, the morrow is in the hand of the god. As one sage put it, human words and divine deeds are never the same, for the god's will prevails. A striking example of what Egyptians hoped for from their gods comes from a prayer of King Ramesses IV to Osiris. The king asked for long life, strength, sight, hearing, and joy, as well as abundance of food and drink. He requested that his children inherit his throne, that the Nile rise high each year to sustain offerings for the gods, and that the land, its people, animals, and trees be protected. His plea ended with a powerful reminder. Since the god had created all things, he had a duty to care for them and could not abandon his creation. This expression captures the Egyptian view of divine responsibility toward the world and humanity. No systematic account of Egyptian ideas about the gods exists before the New Kingdom. For earlier times, especially the Old and Middle Kingdoms, what we know must be pieced together from scattered allusions and fragments. The most accessible evidence comes from personal names, many of which included the names of gods. Such theophoric names, usually given by the father when the child was first presented to him, reflected a belief that children were gifts from the gods, and that invoking a divine name would bring protection and fortune. Old Kingdom names suggest that gods were understood as beings who abide, appear like the sun, live, and are lords of life. They are described as great, powerful, strong, merciful, noble, just, and beautiful. Like humans, they were thought to possess a ka, sometimes several, and these were believed to be pure, mighty, and enduring. Their bi'ah, or visible manifestations, were said to appear like the sun. Gods were believed to create and nurture children, to guide and protect them, to clothe, feed, and heal them, and to hold their lives in their hands. Humanity was their servant, bound to adore them. These qualities are especially frequent in relation to Ptah, largely because many surviving inscriptions from the Old Kingdom come from Memphis, his great center of worship. But the same descriptions could apply to other deities as well. By the Middle Kingdom, new qualities appear. Gods are called sweet and pleasant, and people are described as their sons and daughters. Gods make their devotees good. They are said to celebrate festivals, and they are no longer confined to temples, but are imagined traveling on lakes and rivers, joining public life more directly. This greater accessibility matches the broader religious changes after the social turmoil between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, when beliefs became more open to the wider population. Despite this, the hymns and prayers of the Old and Middle Kingdoms are largely impersonal. They dwell on the grandeur of gods, their crowns, scepters, and honors, often reciting mythological details without expressing personal devotion. Two examples illustrate this. One praises the rising sun as Re-Harakt, who illuminates the land and defeats his enemies, while another exalts Min Horus, lord of power, honored across Egypt and Nubia. These texts reveal little about individual relationships with the divine, though by the New Kingdom such personal prayers begin to appear more clearly. The force that allowed gods to act beyond human capacity was called Heka, magical power. This was not exclusive to deities. Kings and skilled magicians also possessed it, though in lesser measure. In rare cases, a magician who claimed greater command of this power might even attempt to compel a god's cooperation. Magic was equally vital for the dead, and funerary texts such as the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and Book of the Dead are filled with spells originally devised for the living but adapted to secure safe passage and sustenance in the afterlife. From the Egyptian perspective, every religious act was a form of magic, since any contact with gods or the dead required the use of Heka. Indeed, the Egyptian language had no exact word for religion. Heka was the closest expression of the idea. From a modern point of view, magic can be seen as actions performed by the living for tangible benefits in their own world, often requiring supernatural assistance. Though gods and the dead might be invoked, such practices belong to the realm of ritual power rather than theology. Magical power in Egypt was believed to manifest itself through both words and actions. Its effects could be perceived in the visible world, but it also worked in the unseen realm, which was considered just as real. The gods, and to a lesser extent magicians, possessed such power to a degree that their actions could shape both realities. Khnum, for example, was said to fashion human beings on a potter's wheel, while the spoken word itself was seen as capable of bringing things into existence. To utter a word was to call forth the reality it represented, which explains why blessings were thought to carry positive force, and curses were to be avoided. A name, in particular, was tied to the essence of a being, and knowing it granted authority over that being. Ptah, for instance, was said to have brought the world into being simply by naming its elements. This power also extended to writing. Hieroglyphs, composed of images of living creatures and objects, carried inherent magical potency. They not only expressed words, but were thought capable of taking on a mysterious existence themselves. Over time, gods originally tied to natural forces, animals, or objects were reimagined in human form, while abstract concepts were also personified. This blending allowed Egyptians to treat ideas such as fate, time, or natural materials in the same way as their traditional gods. Examples include Shoi, fate, as a man, Renenet, nourishment, as a woman, Napri, corn, as a god, Nub, gold, as a goddess, and deities tied to the seasons or regions like Akhet, one flood, Shomu, summer, or Amentet, the west. Among all such personifications, Ma'at was the most significant. She embodied both truth and justice, appearing as early as the Second Dynasty and symbolized by the ostrich feather. As the daughter of Re, she accompanied the sun god in his daily journey, ensuring that the cosmos remained ordered and just. The defining feature of every god was power itself, often symbolized by the Sekhem scepter. Osiris, for example, was not only regarded as a great power, but also represented by such a scepter in his temple at Abydos. This sacred object was treated as if it were the god himself, adorned with a face, feathers, cobras, and precious inlays, and carried in solemn processions. Despite their vast pantheon, Egyptians never organized their gods into a neat system like the Greeks did. Their local deities were too deeply ingrained, and when one god rose to national prominence, the others were usually reinterpreted as forms or aspects of him rather than discarded. Only a few minor deities were assigned narrower roles, while others, particularly personifications of abstract ideas, expanded the pantheon further. By his 10th year, Akhenaton even dropped the name of Horus from his god's title, leaving Re, ruler of the two horizons, rejoicing in the horizon in his name of Re, the father who has come as Aton, This step severed the last links with older traditions, presenting Aton as the supreme and singular power. Akhenaton cast himself not as the creator of this doctrine, but as its prophet, claiming that his teaching came directly from Aton. The creed itself was expressed most beautifully in hymns attributed to the king. Poetic praises of the sun as the source of life, truth, and love. Supporters of the new faith were drawn both by conviction and by opportunity, some swayed by genuine belief, others by royal favor or material rewards. Yet hostility persisted. Many saw the king as a fanatic, even a madman, and the common people clung to their familiar household gods. In the workers' village near Amarna, evidence shows continued devotion to deities such as Taweret, Bes, Hathor, and Isis. Akhenaton and his circle seem to have ignored these private practices, focusing entirely on their devotion to Aton. Some have speculated that Akhenaton envisioned a universal religion, stripped of local myths, suitable for all peoples of Egypt's empire. Yet there is little sign of such a political motive. Beyond building a temple for Aton in Nubia, he showed no effort to spread the cult abroad. His inscriptions and monuments reveal a man wholly absorbed in his relationship with his god, indifferent to other nations and even to his own people, except for his queen and daughters, who alone shared in the divine rays of Aton's life-giving light. Akhenaton's insistence on styling himself as the king who lives in truth reveals how deeply he valued the concept of truth. In this context, truth may well be understood as reality, suggesting that he saw himself and wished to be seen as a realist. In fact, the only elements in the depiction of his god that might be called unrealistic were the cobra and the rays ending in hands holding the symbol of life. Yet even these can be explained. The cobra was a standard emblem of kingship, while the hands were most likely a poetic expression given visual form. His pursuit of realism is also evident in the strong impulse he gave to Egyptian art. The style of his reign brought naturalism into both painting and sculpture, most notably in his own portraits. Even in written records, a change is visible. Instead of the old, archaic language that was no longer spoken and scarcely understood, inscriptions began to reflect the living idiom of the people. After 17 years, Akhenaton's death marked the decline of his religious experiment. With its driving force gone, the tide of reaction quickly rose. His second successor, originally named Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, openly abandoned the new faith by altering his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. He restored the old cults, returned to Thebes, and was buried there. Under Horemheb, who followed, a determined campaign was launched to erase Akhenaton's legacy. His name, images, and even the god's name when enclosed in royal cartouches were deliberately destroyed. Yet it is telling that this fury was directed more against Akhenaton himself than against Aton. The sun disk with its rays was never again depicted in the same form, but wherever earlier images survived, they were generally left untouched. In the collective memory of Egypt, however, Akhenaton was condemned as the enemy of Akhetaton, and his reign was remembered as the time of the rebel. According to official doctrine, the king alone was regarded as the proper link between mortals and the gods. In the Old and Middle Kingdoms, divine figures never appear on monuments set up by ordinary people, nor are common individuals shown worshipping a god directly. Yet inscriptions reveal that many served as priests or bore names that invoked deities, showing how closely daily life was bound to religion. The absence of divine images on private tombs and stelae cannot therefore be explained by indifference, but rather by the belief that the king, as the son of a god and divine himself, was the only human qualified to stand in their presence. Only from the second intermediate period do depictions of gods begin to appear on private monuments, at first cautiously, and then with increasing confidence during the New Kingdom, when ordinary people are shown lifting their hands in prayer or offering gifts before divine figures. This shift reflects the broader democratization of religion that emerged by the time of the 12th dynasty, though it was never formally acknowledged by the state. Officially, every temple was still said to be built by the king, and he alone remained the mediator between humanity and the gods. Yet the heresy of Akhenaton, despite its failure, marked a turning point. After the Amarna Age, inscriptions began to express far more openly the personal hopes, fears, and appeals of individuals. From the 19th dynasty onward, prayers inscribed on papyri and, above all, on the stelae from Deir el-Medineh, home of the artisans who carved the royal tombs, reveal this new spirit. These craftsmen, though privileged by steady pay, were still close in outlook to the wider peasant class, and their monuments give us rare insight into the feelings of ordinary Egyptians. In these texts, humility before the gods replaces the earlier tone of self-assurance. Worshippers admit their sins, plead for mercy, and describe the punishments they believe the gods have inflicted upon them. One man confesses to swearing a false oath by the moon god Thoth, and begs forgiveness after being struck by divine power. Another prays to Amun, Ptah, and Thoth to release him from blindness, which he interprets as a punishment for false testimony. Others record vows to set up memorials or hymns if the god heals a sick relative. These appeals rest on a new awareness. Humans are weak, prone to error, and dependent on divine mercy, while the gods are just but compassionate. Because access to the great temples in Thebes was likely beyond them, people sought the gods in smaller shrines and local sanctuaries. Statues placed there were believed to embody the gods no less than those in grand temples, and these local manifestations often acquired their own names and attributes, tied to the village or site where they were worshipped. Alongside such forms of Amun, Ptah, or Sekhmet, smaller household gods also gained popularity. They had no temples of their own, but were worshipped in domestic settings, reflecting their closeness to everyday life. Their shapes were often grotesque or humorous, echoing the Egyptian delight in satire and storytelling, in which even the greatest gods were sometimes portrayed with human weaknesses and comic situations. Through these changes, religion became more personal, allowing ordinary people to approach the gods directly with confessions, petitions, and prayers for mercy, something earlier periods had reserved almost entirely for the king. Taweret, whose name means the Great One and is known to us in its Greek form Tauris, was a household goddess who offered protection to women and children. She was depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, usually leaning against the sign of protection. Figurines of Taweret were commonly placed in homes to safeguard mothers during childbirth and shield infants from harm. She belonged to the class of intimate domestic deities, yet unlike most others of her kind, she eventually received a formal temple at Karnak. Another figure of similar character was Bes, portrayed as a squat dwarf with bowed legs, a wide mouth with a protruding tongue, a lion-like beard, and animal ears and tail. Though he danced and played music for the amusement of the gods, his role in daily life was to bring cheer and protection to households. His image appeared frequently on walls, beds, mirrors, and cosmetic items. Over time, popular imagination even reshaped major gods such as Ptah and Re into dwarf-like forms resembling Bes. Re himself was described in texts as a small figure spanning the space between heaven and earth, despite being millions of cubits in size. Magical papyri often bore his image in dwarf form as a charm, and he was sometimes shown crouched at the prow of the solar bark. Closely related is a figure named Aha, the fighter, who, together with Taweret and other fantastical beings, was carved onto protective wands and knives fashioned from hippopotamus ivory meant to ward off malevolent forces. Among the more popular protective deities was Shed, the savior. Originally tied to Osiris, the guardian god of this, Shed came to be imagined as a youthful prince hunting wild beasts and dangerous creatures such as lions, crocodiles, and serpents. Amulets showing his image were worn as defense against these threats. In time, he was merged with the youthful Horus and depicted as a divine child standing upon crocodiles, clutching snakes, scorpions, and gazelles, with stelae inscribed with protective spells set up in homes for his blessing. On the Theban West Bank, the cobra goddess Merziger arose as a means to placate the deadly serpent. Known as Mistress of the West, she was envisioned either as a snake or a woman with a serpent's head. Her cult was tied to the towering peak above the Valley of the Kings, itself considered her embodiment. The mountain slopes became dotted with small shrines and stelae dedicated to her and other guardians of the necropolis. Given the proximity of Hathor's temple at Deir el-Bahari, Merziger was sometimes treated as a form of Hathor. This process of deifying natural or man-made objects persisted throughout Egyptian history. Mountains, trees, statues, and monuments could all be regarded as divine seats. The Great Sphinx at Giza, originally carved to resemble a lion with a king's head, was later revered as a form of the sun god and imitated in temple avenues. A letter from Thebes gives us a revealing list of such local deities alongside the great triad of Amun, Mut, and Khons. It invokes spirits in trees, statues of Amenhotep I, Hathor linked with sacred plants, groups of baboons sacred to Thoth, and temple gates themselves, each believed to hold divine power. Amenhotep I, in particular, became one of the most beloved figures of the Theban West Bank. His special status derived partly from his role in establishing the royal necropolis and organizing the community of artisans at Deir el-Medineh. Over time, multiple statues of him appeared in different sanctuaries, each developing its own title and character. His cult spread widely, and he was revered almost like a patron saint of Theban workers, his identity branching into various distinct but related forms of veneration. Perhaps the clearest example of how deeply the Egyptians believed their gods took part in human life is found in the practice of oracles. Through them, people expected the deities to reveal their will, guidance, or judgment, and the Egyptians devised unique methods to draw such responses. The medium was usually the statue of the god, which could be asked questions, though at times it was said that the god acted on his own initiative. This custom appears relatively late, with the first clear references dating to the New Kingdom. Some have thought the practice was borrowed from abroad, but its distinctively Egyptian procedure suggests it developed locally as a natural outcome of the wish to know divine intention. A famous early example is the account of Thutmosis III, who recalled how, as a boy, the statue of Amun halted during a temple procession and led him to a sacred place, marking him out as the future ruler. From this time onward, oracles multiplied. While the king often consulted the gods in matters of state, ordinary people also appealed to them on personal concerns. Since access to the inner sanctuary was limited to the king and certain priests, consultation usually occurred during festivals, when the god's statue, concealed within a shrine carried on a bark, was brought outside. Questions were posed either aloud or written in two forms, affirmative and negative, and placed before the shrine. The deity's answer was shown by the bearers, moving toward the positive indicated approval, toward the negative refusal. In other cases, the statue might advance to signify a favorable response or retreat to show rejection. Although the wishes of the questioner may sometimes have influenced the movements of the bearers, there is no reason to assume deliberate deception. The carriers were purified lay priests, and the petitioners themselves often belonged to the priesthood. If foul play had been suspected, unfavorable rulings would not have been accepted. Such practices reflect the Egyptian conviction that human actions ought to be aligned with divine will. They often declared that an event or decision was what the god has decreed. Yet moral standards were thought to come not only from the gods, but also from society itself. What pleased both men and gods was considered good and just. Language illustrates this blending of aesthetic and ethical values. The word nefer meant both good and beautiful, implying what was pleasing, fortunate, and morally sound. Its opposites included jau, meaning bad, sad, or unlucky, and boyen, suggesting something harmful or disastrous. Another term, ma, conveyed truth, justice, and right, personified by the goddess Maat, whose opposites were falsehood and wrongdoing. For all this, Egyptians held individuals fully responsible for their actions. Fate was acknowledged, but it was not thought to determine human choice. Instead, fate described external circumstances shaping life, which people could counteract through effort. What we would call conscience was believed to reside in the heart, the seat of thought, desire, and judgment. The voice of the heart was regarded as the voice of the divine, and one who followed it rightly was considered blessed. Egyptian ethics were practical rather than abstract. Good was pursued because it was advantageous, bringing divine favor, social respect, and lasting remembrance. To secure a good name was a reward in itself, for a name was thought to be part of one's very existence, and a name honored and remembered meant life enduring beyond death. Good conduct and moral behavior were closely tied to what Egyptians considered doing what is right, and these values were instilled in the young through a special body of wisdom literature known as teachings. These writings consisted of collections of advice and practical guidance, presented as the words of men who had succeeded in life and therefore offered models for others to follow. One of the most notable examples is the Teaching of Amun, composed during the late New Kingdom, parts of which later found their way, in altered form, into the biblical book of Proverbs. The oldest known example, however, is the Teaching of Ptahhotep, a vizier of the 5th dynasty, which emphasizes how one should act toward superiors and authorities. Its central message is that since events unfold according to the will of the divine, and since it is the gods who determine a person's station, the wisest course is to live in harmony with the established order rather than oppose it. During the Old Kingdom, this order rested primarily on the structure of government and administration. By the Middle Kingdom, however, service to the gods was added as an essential element of maintaining order. The gods were understood to have created heaven and earth for the benefit of humankind, but they also punished disobedience, striking down those who opposed their will. Divine justice was unavoidable, since God knows every name. Moreover, moral action carried more weight than ritual offerings. Better the virtue of the just than the ox of one who commits wrong. Yet experience showed that justice did not always manifest itself in life. Since Egyptians had long believed that existence continued beyond death, it was natural for them to conclude that divine justice could be delayed until the afterlife. From the Middle Kingdom onward, the idea that one's fate after death depended on one's earthly actions became a widespread belief. This conviction likely arose during the troubled years of the First Intermediate Period, when political and social instability shaped a new way of thinking about human destiny. This uncertainty also produced literature of a deeply pessimistic tone. A striking example is The Dispute with His Soul, in which a man, disillusioned by the corruption and injustice around him, resolves to end his life. He pleads with his soul to accompany him into the flames, while the soul resists, reminding him of the joys of life and the emptiness of death. At last, however, the soul concedes when the man argues that death will unite him with the gods, where he might work to restore balance to the world. Such writings reflect not abstract philosophy, but the turmoil of their time. In general, however, Egyptians were not a pessimistic people. Their usual outlook on life was optimistic, filled with enjoyment of its pleasures, while always mindful of death and preparing for it according to their means. Explicit expressions of a seize the day attitude are rare, found mostly in harpists' songs performed at feasts, and even these stand in contrast to the deeply rooted conviction that life after death was real and enduring. Egyptians believed consistently in immortality, though they had no distinct word for it. The same term was used for both earthly and eternal life. Still, this immortality was not unconditional. There were requirements to be met in order to secure it. How far back this belief extends is uncertain. In prehistoric and early dynastic times, evidence comes solely from archaeology. Graves from these periods contain food and goods clearly intended for use in another world, suggesting a conviction that existence would continue much like life before death. The natural preservation of bodies in Egypt's dry climate may also have reinforced the idea of life persisting beyond death. Burial customs varied by place and time, but within a given cemetery they were fairly consistent, reflecting local traditions and evolving funerary beliefs. In historical times, the dead were generally laid to rest facing east, while in the prehistoric period, burials often placed the body on its left side, with the head turned south and the face directed west. The West consistently held symbolic significance as the land of the dead, a belief that endured into the Coptic period, where Amente was used as a translation for the Greek idea of Hades. The West was personified as the goddess Amentet, who is frequently shown greeting the deceased into her domain. This association was closely linked to the daily setting of the sun in the West, reinforcing the idea that it was the natural realm of the departed. Inscriptions from the Old Kingdom often describe the dead as traveling to the beautiful West along sacred paths, where they joined the community of Westerners, a respectful term for the departed. There they dwelled under the authority of the king, reflecting the same hierarchical order that had structured their earthly lives. Food and goods were provided for their sustenance at burial, with offerings later renewed by family members. Traditionally, tombs and equipment were considered gifts from the king, described in formulaic inscriptions known as Hotep Dinesu, the offering that the king gives. Over time, the literal provision of goods gave way to standardized lists of offerings: bread, beer, cattle, poultry, clothing, and vessels, invoked as prayers to the gods of the West who shared in granting these provisions. This conception of the afterlife was most natural in the narrow Nile Valley, where the western desert was always visible and close at hand. In contrast, in the northern delta, where the desert was far removed, a different vision emerged. The dead were believed to rise into the sky, joining the stars. Though this idea was later blended with the Western conception, traces of the celestial belief persisted. With the ascendancy of the sun cult at Heliopolis in the 5th dynasty, the notion of the dead reaching heaven became prominent. Pyramid texts vividly describe the deceased king's ascent, whether by climbing a celestial ladder, grasping the tail of a cosmic cow, flying upward as a bird, or being lifted by incense smoke or desert winds. These poetic images reflect the conviction that heaven was the ultimate home of the soul. The form of the soul itself offers further insight. At death, the soul was believed to leave the body as a bird. The Egyptians associated it with the bai, a stork-like bird, or the ik, a crested ibis, both of which symbolized freedom of movement and transformation. The bai came to mean soul or manifestation, representing the ability to assume different forms, while the ik was translated as spirit or shining spirit, linked to brilliance and radiance. Over time, ik shifted toward the idea of a ghost or supernatural presence, surviving in later Egyptian usage with this meaning. Even more elusive is the notion of the ka, another essential spiritual component. It has been interpreted as the personal essence of an individual, encompassing personality, vitality, fortune, and social standing. The ki was not just abstract. It was thought of as a tangible double, capable of existence apart from the body. The pyramid texts, written during the 5th and 6th dynasties, focus on the destiny of kings, but their ideas were eventually extended to all Egyptians. The dead were imagined as stars shining on the body of the sky goddess Nut, who was described as she of 1,000 souls. Coffins and tomb chambers were decorated to reflect this cosmic imagery. Ceilings painted with stars, lids inscribed with welcoming words from Nut and Geb, uniting the deceased with both sky and earth. Later, theology emphasized the king as the son of Re, joining his divine father in the sunboat that sailed across the heavens. This royal destiny soon became the hope of ordinary people as well, who saw themselves as creations of Ra and thus shared in his eternal cycle. The solar religion gained strength not merely because Egyptians recognized the sun's role in sustaining life, but because they saw in its daily journey a reflection of their own existence. Just as the sun rose, shone, and set only to return again, so too did human life follow a cycle that promised renewal after death. This belief gave comfort and assurance, linking the fate of the soul with the eternal rhythm of the sun. In historical times, the dead were generally laid to rest facing east, while in the prehistoric period, burials often placed the body on its left side, with the head turned south and the face directed west. The West consistently held symbolic significance as the land of the dead, a belief that endured into the Coptic period, where Amente was used as a translation for the Greek idea of Hades. The West was personified as the goddess Amentet, who is frequently shown greeting the deceased into her domain. This association was closely linked to the daily setting of the sun in the West, reinforcing the idea that it was the natural realm of the departed. Inscriptions from the Old Kingdom often describe the dead as traveling to the beautiful West along sacred paths, where they joined the community of Westerners, a respectful term for the departed. There they dwelled under the authority of the king, reflecting the same hierarchical order that had structured their earthly lives. Food and goods were provided for their sustenance at burial, with offerings later renewed by family members. Traditionally, tombs and equipment were considered gifts from the king, described in formulaic inscriptions known as Hotep Dinesu, the offering that the king gives. Over time, the literal provision of goods gave way to standardized lists of offerings: bread, beer, cattle, poultry, clothing, and vessels, invoked as prayers to the gods of the West who shared in granting these provisions. This conception of the afterlife was most natural in the narrow Nile Valley, where the western desert was always visible and close at hand. In contrast, in the northern delta, where the desert was far removed, a different vision emerged. The dead were believed to rise into the sky, joining the stars. Though this idea was later blended with the Western conception, traces of the celestial belief persisted. With the ascendancy of the sun cult at Heliopolis in the 5th dynasty, the notion of the dead reaching heaven became prominent. Pyramid texts vividly describe the deceased king's ascent, whether by climbing a celestial ladder, grasping the tail of a cosmic cow, flying upward as a bird, or being lifted by incense smoke or desert winds. These poetic images reflect the conviction that heaven was the ultimate home of the soul. The form of the soul itself offers further insight. At death, the soul was believed to leave the body as a bird. The Egyptians associated it with the bai, a stork-like bird, or the ik, a crested ibis, both of which symbolized freedom of movement and transformation. The bai came to mean soul or manifestation, representing the ability to assume different forms, while the ik was translated as spirit or shining spirit, linked to brilliance and radiance. Over time, ik shifted toward the idea of a ghost or supernatural presence, surviving in later Egyptian usage with this meaning. Even more elusive is the notion of the ka, another essential spiritual component. It has been interpreted as the personal essence of an individual, encompassing personality, vitality, fortune, and social standing. The ki was not just abstract. It was thought of as a tangible double, capable of existence apart from the body. The pyramid texts, written during the 5th and 6th dynasties, focus on the destiny of kings, but their ideas were eventually extended to all Egyptians. The dead were imagined as stars shining on the body of the sky goddess Nut, who was described as she of 1,000 souls. Coffins and tomb chambers were decorated to reflect this cosmic imagery. Ceilings painted with stars, lids inscribed with welcoming words from Nut and Geb, uniting the deceased with both sky and earth. Later, theology emphasized the king as the son of Re, joining his divine father in the sunboat that sailed across the heavens. This royal destiny soon became the hope of ordinary people as well, who saw themselves as creations of Ra and thus shared in his eternal cycle. The solar religion gained strength not merely because Egyptians recognized the sun's role in sustaining life, but because they saw in its daily journey a reflection of their own existence. Just as the sun rose, shone, and set only to return again, so too did human life follow a cycle that promised renewal after death. This belief gave comfort and assurance, linking the fate of the soul with the eternal rhythm of the sun. The sun rises in the morning, travels across the sky giving light and warmth, and then disappears in the evening on the western horizon. Yet this disappearance is only temporary, for the sun continues to live, as proven by its return each morning after passing through the unseen world of night. The Egyptians saw in this cycle a clear parallel to human life. A person is born, like the rising sun, lives out their earthly existence, and dies like the setting sun. But just as the sun's disappearance is not final, so too human death was believed to be only a transition. Life was thought to continue in another realm, and renewal or rebirth was regarded as inevitable. The West, where both the sun and people vanished, came to symbolize life itself and was called Ankh, life. To go west was to rest in life, and phrases such as Wam Ankh, he who repeats life, or later Ankh Hotep, he who lives and rests, were used for the dead. Even the coffin was called Neb Ankh, Lord of Life. The precise details of when or how rebirth occurred were left vague, but this did not trouble believers. What mattered was the conviction that, like the king, the deceased joined the sun god's nightly journey and participated in the eternal rhythm of renewal. Over time, this analogy deepened into an identification, and the dead were sometimes described as becoming part of the sun god's own essence, an excellent spirit of Re. Alongside the daily course of the sun, two other recurring events strengthened Egyptian ideas of death and rebirth: the annual flooding of the Nile and the renewed growth of vegetation. Each year the river overflowed its banks, bringing life-giving water to the land, and from this rebirth of nature, the people drew inspiration. For an agricultural society, the connection between water, fertility, and life was powerful, and very early it became associated with the figure of Osiris. Scholars have long debated the origins of Osiris. One view holds that he was originally a mortal king who ruled Egypt in remote times from the eastern delta. His violent death, said to have been caused by his brother Set, was seen as the memory of a real rebellion in which Upper Egypt challenged his rule. This event supposedly led to the division of the land into two kingdoms, later reunited through the victory of Horus, the son of Osiris. In this interpretation, Osiris was deified after death, and his story became a creed of salvation, symbolizing the triumph of justice over evil and promising eternal life to the dead. Isis, his sister and wife, was understood as the personification of his throne, while Nephthys, the other sister, represented his residence. Another theory regards Osiris not as a historical king, but as a symbol of the Nile's flooding and the rebirth of vegetation. This role of Osiris as a fertility god is attested throughout Egyptian history and may have existed from the earliest times. Yet the oldest pyramid texts, particularly those in the tomb of King Yunus, do not clearly identify Osiris with the flood. In these passages, it is the deceased king himself who is compared to the rising waters, likened to a crocodile emerging from the flood, or described as bringing forth plants. Only because Yunus was identified with Osiris in the ritual texts does the connection appear, but in the older layers of the texts, the king is more often described as Horus, the son of Osiris, rather than Osiris himself. In later versions of the pyramid texts, Osiris is increasingly linked with the Nile and with fertility, but this seems to have developed from poetic identifications of the king with natural forces. Originally, the connection between Osiris and kingship was central. The king was seen as taking the throne of Osiris in death, just as Osiris once ruled the spirits of the dead. Gradually, this privilege was extended from kings to queens, and then to ordinary people, shifting the emphasis from divine rulership to universal resurrection. By stressing death and renewal rather than kingship, Osiris came to symbolize the persistence of life beyond death for all, embodying the cycle of the Nile's floods, the return of vegetation, and the survival of the human soul. In this way, Osiris became the eternal figure of life enduring through death. For the Egyptians, nothing seemed more natural than to draw a parallel between resurrection and the growth of a seed. A text from the first intermediate period compares the soul of the dead with Napri, the personification of grain, who lives after he has died. From the Middle Kingdom onward, Osiris is frequently portrayed as the god of floods and vegetation, and in the New Kingdom his connection with the renewal of plant life is vividly expressed in the so-called corn Osiris. This ritual object was a wooden box shaped like a mummified Osiris, filled with soil in which seeds of grain were sown. When watered, the seeds sprouted and grew through holes in the lid, symbolizing rebirth. In other instances, earth molded into the form of Osiris was spread over linen and set upon a reed mat, again to suggest life springing forth from death. Osiris gradually became the model for all the departed, and his cult spread widely across Egypt. Initially resisted, he was eventually absorbed into the solar theology of Heliopolis as the son of the earth god Geb. His worship was not primarily driven by the state or priesthood, but by popular devotion, and Abydos emerged as the central place of pilgrimage associated with him. There, one of the earliest royal tombs, believed to belong to King Jer of the First Dynasty, was identified as the resting place of Osiris, and a temple dedicated to him was built. From then on, people from across Egypt sought to be buried at Abydos, or at least to erect cenotaphs and stelae near his shrine. Later, King Seti I constructed a grand temple at Abydos with an underground cenotaph, even though he already possessed a mortuary temple and tomb at Thebes. Egyptian conservatism ensured that even with the identification of the deceased with Osiris, older traditions were not discarded. Ancient funerary spells continued to be recited, their purpose being to protect and sustain the dead. Many of these originated in the pyramid texts, but they were adapted for private individuals and expanded with new additions. At first, they were inscribed on the inside of coffins, the so-called coffin texts, and later written on papyri placed with the deceased, forming what we call the Book of the Dead. Far from being a systematic theology of the afterlife, this was essentially a collection of magical formulas designed to equip the dead with power and protection. Egyptians themselves recognized the primitive and unsophisticated nature of these texts, and attempts were sometimes made to refine their meaning through symbolic interpretation. The spells promised many forms of assistance: protection from hunger and thirst, the power to assume the shapes of animals, and, most importantly, the ability to emerge from the tomb into daylight to enjoy offerings. This concept, known as coming forth by day, became so central that it gave its name to the entire collection. In the pyramid texts, mastery of such spells was seen as the key to happiness after death, fitting for the king, who was himself divine. For ordinary people, however, another idea grew in importance: that life after death depended not only on magical knowledge, but also on moral conduct during earthly existence. This moral dimension drew directly on the myth of Osiris. Just as he had been accused by Set before Re and the other gods in Heliopolis, only to be vindicated by the judgment of the divine court with Thoth's help, so too every deceased person sought to be declared true of voice, that is, justified. In the afterlife, Osiris presided over the judgment of souls, assisted by 42 assessors. The famous scene in funerary papyri shows the deceased led before Osiris, while Anubis weighs the heart against the symbol of truth, often an ostrich feather or the figure of the goddess Maat, and Thoth records the outcome. Ideally, the scales balance perfectly, meaning that the heart, understood as the seat of thought and will, is in harmony with truth. Whether a sinful heart was imagined to be too heavy from wrongdoing or too light from lack of virtue is unclear. What mattered was that any imbalance marked failure. For the Egyptians, the just weight of the heart was the condition for eternal life in the company of Osiris. If the weighing of the heart produced a favorable result, the deceased was pronounced true of voice, like Osiris, and granted entry into his realm of life and bliss. If, however, the test went against him, he was handed over to the terrifying devourer of the dead, a monster composed of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, who stood ready beside the scales. This moment of judgment placed enormous importance on moral worth, yet the so-called negative confession in the Book of the Dead, where the deceased denies having committed various sins, suggests that the Egyptians still leaned on magical formulas to secure salvation. While it may appear like another spell, the very existence of these denials points to an accepted moral code, tightly bound with the Osirian faith. From then onward, Osiris was inseparable from this ethical dimension. The preservation of the body became another vital condition for survival after death, though it gained significance only gradually. Prehistoric burials show no trace of embalming, though isolated cases of mummification appear as early as the first dynasties. By the fourth dynasty, embalming had become more common, as evidenced by the appearance of canopic jars, which held the organs removed during the process. These jars were placed under the protection of the four sons of Horus, Imset, Hapi, Duamutef, and Kebesenuf. Fear of bodily decay encouraged the development of elaborate embalming techniques, aimed at maintaining the body's physical features and thereby preserving the identity of the deceased. In the same period, a curious custom arose to guard against the loss of the head. Sculpted reserve heads were placed in tombs carved from stone with lifelike detail. Egypt's dry climate further aided natural preservation, likely reinforcing the belief that keeping the body intact was essential to continued existence. Over time, wooden coffins gave way to stone ones, and often multiple coffins were nested together, especially in royal burials, reflecting growing anxiety about bodily survival. This concern also explains the presence of everyday objects in tombs. Furniture, vessels, and tools were thought to accompany the deceased into the next life. Chapter 30 of the Book of the Dead provides another striking example of how Egyptians combined ethics with magical assistance. Addressed to the heart, the seat of thought and memory, it pleads with it not to betray its owner before the judges, not to testify against him, and to remain loyal. From the Second Intermediate Period onward, this spell was inscribed on scarab amulets, known as heart scarabs, placed over the chest of the mummy. The scarab, long associated with the rising sun and rebirth, became the perfect substitute for the heart, ensuring it would support rather than condemn its owner. Egyptian ideas of the afterlife evolved over time. Up to the mid-18th dynasty, life beyond was seen largely as a continuation of earthly existence. Tomb paintings and sculptures depict the deceased among family, servants, possessions, and daily activities, suggesting a direct replication of their worldly life. Scholars have debated whether these scenes were intended simply as proud records, or whether they had magical force, ensuring the scenes depicted would become reality in the afterlife. The frequent use of words like eternally beside such images supports the magical interpretation, as does their placement in chambers never meant for public viewing. From the late Old Kingdom onward, and especially during the First Intermediate and Middle Kingdoms, wooden models began to replace wall scenes. These included miniature servants, craftsmen, livestock, boats, and workshops, often arranged in lively groups on wooden bases. They showed activities such as plowing, weaving, brewing, and shipbuilding, all rendered with remarkable craftsmanship. Placed in hidden chambers with the coffin, these models clearly served as magical substitutes for real possessions, ensuring the deceased would continue to enjoy the comforts and necessities of earthly life in the world beyond. Up until well into the Middle Kingdom, it was commonly believed that in the afterlife, a wealthy man would continue to have menial work carried out on his behalf. Servants were shown either in wall paintings within tombs or as small statues placed in the burial chamber, ensuring their presence in the next world. For those of lower status, it is difficult to say what their own expectations were, but it seems natural to assume that they thought they would keep serving their masters beyond death, just as they had in life. Inscriptions hastily scratched onto servant images or written in ink on wooden statuettes suggest that it was not generic attendants who were meant to serve the deceased, but the very same individuals who had worked for him in life. It may even be that the servants themselves hoped to secure an existence after death by identifying with these depictions. During the upheaval of the First Intermediate period, however, a new idea emerged. Every deceased person, regardless of social standing, might be expected to perform labor in the afterlife. To avoid this fate, a magical formula was created, later preserved as Chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead. At the same time, small figurines shaped like the mummy of the deceased began to appear in tombs. These figures, later called Shawabti and then Ushebti, were magically summoned to answer the call for work in place of the dead. Eventually, the figures evolved into clay or stone models of living people, often holding hoes and sacks, ready to work in the fields of the afterlife. Inscribed with the protective spell, they served as answerers at the roll call. Over time, the number of Ushebtis placed in a tomb grew, and in later periods sets of 365 were provided, one for each day of the year, sometimes with overseer figures to manage them. The older practice of burying food, clothing, and other daily necessities with the dead never disappeared, though over time these items were often symbolically represented. Stone models of meat replaced real food, and coffins were painted with depictions of garments, sandals, or jewelry. Objects once reserved for kings, such as crowns and scepters, eventually found their way into the burials of non-royal individuals. By the New Kingdom, these offerings often took the form of amulets made of stone, faience, or metal, placed across the mummy's body. The variety of beliefs about the afterlife shows how complex and often contradictory Egyptian thought could be. Some believed the dead became stars in the sky. Others expected to continue earthly life with all its comforts, while others imagined compulsory field labor unless protected by Ushebtis. Many also expected to join Osiris in his rule of the underworld, or accompany the sun god Re on his daily and nightly journeys across the heavens and through the unseen world. This nightly journey of the sun god was elaborated in two major works of funerary literature: the Book of Gates and the Amduat, Book of What Is in the Underworld. Though filled with elaborate texts and fantastic images, their central theme was the passage of the sun through 12 regions of the night, each guarded and populated by deities, spirits, and strange demons. These compositions were painted on the walls of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings and later appeared on papyri for private individuals. Alongside these cosmic visions, Egyptians also believed in the continuing presence and power of their own family dead. The spirits of ancestors could be dangerous if neglected, but helpful if honored with offerings. Letters were written to the dead on papyrus, linen, or even food containers, asking for aid in earthly problems. Though there was no formal cult of distant ancestors, tombs of relatives were sometimes tended for generations. In the New Kingdom, busts placed in niches within village houses may have represented departed family members, worshipped within the homes where they once lived. Human beings express their religious devotion through repeated acts of worship, carried out in fixed sequences and ceremonies, each shaped by a guiding idea. In Egyptian thought, the living, the gods, and the dead were viewed as three forms of the same being, all with similar needs and desires. Just as the living required food, drink, clothing, shelter, and rest, so too did the gods and the departed. The central purpose of cult practices, whether divine or funerary, was to ensure that these needs were met, thereby sustaining existence beyond the present world. In early times, the homes of the living, the temples of the gods, and the tombs of the dead were built on nearly identical patterns. The difference lay in permanence and status. While ordinary people lived in modest houses and kings in palaces, temples were considered castles of the gods, and tombs the castles of the Ka. Unlike the fragile materials of everyday dwellings, temples and tombs were constructed in stone or carved from living rock to last for eternity. The transition from circular huts to rectangular forms during the late prehistoric period was paralleled in both houses and tombs, and though no early temples survive, depictions of shrines show similar origins in simple huts. Within these spaces, provisions were stored, and attendants ensured comfort, servants for the living, priests for the gods, and funerary priests for the dead. Evidence from prehistoric burials shows food and drink placed with the deceased, proving that sustenance was thought essential after death. Written sources confirm that meals were at the heart of both funerary and temple rites. These rituals began with purification. Water was poured over the hands and incense was burned, followed by offerings of oils and cloths, then libations of water, echoing the washing before meals. Only then was food presented. Over time, uniformity in worship became widespread, especially after the rise of the solar cult of Heliopolis in the Old Kingdom. By the 5th dynasty, kings were seen not only as embodiments of Horus, but also as sons, or even forms, of the sun god Re. Other deities gradually assimilated aspects of solar worship, and by the close of the Old Kingdom, daily rituals across Egypt's temples followed a common liturgy. Solar belief held that the sun god emerged from the primeval waters and was reborn daily, sometimes imagined as rising from the womb of the sky goddess Nut. The king, as both son and embodiment of the sun god, underwent a similar daily purification before being dressed in royal insignia. Water was thus associated with rebirth and vitality, and every temple had a sacred pool for this purpose. Ritual complexity deepened with the spread of Osiris's cult. Myths told of Osiris's revival, either through consuming the eye of Horus or being washed by Horus and Thoth. These ideas blended with solar rites. Purification became not only a solar act, but also symbolic of Osiris's resurrection. Even embalming rituals reflected this, with priests acting as Horus and Thoth, reassembling the king's body through lustration. With the passing centuries, what had once been the king's privilege extended to all Egyptians. Every deceased person was identified with Osiris, and those who performed funerary rites were seen as playing the role of Horus. Despite this broadening, the foundation of ritual remained the banquet, merged with purification, and reinterpreted through both solar and Osirian symbolism. Records of temple liturgy, preserved in both inscriptions and papyri, provide detailed accounts. Before entering, a priest bathed in the sacred pool. Inside, he lit a fire, prepared incense, and approached the shrine where the god's statue rested overnight. Breaking the seal, unbolting the doors, and opening them, he revealed the deity's image, greeted it with prostration, and recited hymns. Offerings of honey, or even the symbolic figure of Ma'et, the goddess of truth, were presented. More incense was burned in ritual circuits around the statue, after which the image was removed from its shrine, its garments taken off, and the figure anointed with sacred oils. The ritual cleansing of the divine image began once the statue was placed upon a small mound of sand, likely symbolizing the desert from which the sun rose each morning. The figure was censed again and sprinkled with water poured from 4 special vessels, both red and white. After another round of incense, its mouth was purified with 3 types of natron. The priest then clothed the image with a headdress and brightly colored garments, adorned it with jewels, applied oils, and painted its eyelids with green and black pigments. Finally, the god was vested with the emblems of kingship. Once the dressing was complete, a meal was offered. The statue was returned to its shrine. The altar was purified, and dishes of food and drink were laid before the deity, each course raised in offering. When the banquet ended, the shrine doors were closed and sealed. The priest carefully purified the space, even removing his own footprints before departing. At every stage, formulae and prayers were spoken. A similar rite was carried out for the living king, who was himself regarded as priest of the gods. At dawn, in a special chamber called the House of the Morning, the king was sprinkled with water from the sacred pool by 2 priests, who represented Horus and Thoth, or Horus and Set, and may have worn their masks. With prayers recited, the rite bestowed life and fortune upon him and renewed his youth. Afterward, he was fumigated with incense, given natron to chew, and then dressed, anointed, and adorned with royal ornaments. Only then was he fit to perform the temple liturgy. The same purifying rites were extended to the dead, echoing the belief that Osiris himself had once been cleansed in this way. While the body lay inaccessible within the tomb, substitute ceremonies were conducted daily before a statue placed in the funerary chapel. To prepare such an image, the opening of the mouth ceremony was performed in the sculptor's workshop. Through this complex rite, the statue was believed to receive life and the faculties of a living being. This ancient ritual, first mentioned in the 4th dynasty, reached its most elaborate form in later times. It began with purifications, placing the statue on sand, washing it with water, applying natron, and fumigating it with incense. A dialogue influenced by the Osiris myth followed between priests and sculptors. Then an ox was sacrificed, its foreleg and heart offered to the statue, along with the beheading of a goat and goose. The mouth and eyes were touched with these offerings, and with tools such as adzes, symbolically granting the statue breath, sight, and speech. In the final stage, the statue was dressed with headdress, clothing, and jewels, anointed, fumigated, and presented with a banquet of meat and drink before being installed in its destined place. The repast included a bull, gazelles, and a goose, echoes of a time when Egyptians still lived as hunters before turning to farming. While the precise rites of embalming were not recorded in detail, surviving papyri from the late period preserve fragments of the ritual, mostly prayers spoken by priests. Examination of preserved mummies shows that embalming evolved gradually, with multiple methods depending on wealth and status. Poorer Egyptians often relied on natural preservation by the desert sands, while the wealthy underwent elaborate treatment. The process usually began soon after death and lasted about 70 days. The embalming itself was believed to repeat the treatment given to Osiris, making the deceased into a new Osiris. The chief embalmer took on the role of Anubis, while his assistants acted as the sons of Horus. Priests supervised the work, instructed the embalmers, and recited the sacred words that ensured the body would endure for eternity. The embalming process began with the washing of the body in Nile water, which was believed to hold life-giving power. The intestines, most prone to decay, were then removed, and the body was packed with natron to dry it. Oils, resins, and unguents were applied, and amulets were placed across the body before it was wrapped in linen and laid in a coffin. The water used for purification was carefully stored in jars and buried near the tomb, together with other embalming tools and the wooden table where the work had been carried out. An incision in the left side allowed the removal of the organs, which were then preserved in 4 special jars, later known as canopic jars, each protected by a divine guardian. The heart, however, was generally left in place. The brain was often extracted through the nostrils using a hook. In earlier times, linen was used to replace soft tissue, but later mud and sand were packed under the skin to maintain shape. Materials like cedar oil, myrrh, honey, incense, and wax were believed to carry divine essence, linked to the tears and powers of the gods, and thus gave strength to the dead. The burial rituals, known mostly through tomb paintings, show 2 symbolic journeys, one to Osiris in Lower Egypt, and the other to Abydos in Upper Egypt. These likely echoed royal funerals, with the king presented as Osiris to his northern and southern followers. Later, when adopted by commoners, these scenes were retained as reminders, though they no longer reflected real practice and may also have represented the crossing of the Nile to reach Western cemeteries. The funeral procession carried the coffin on a boat-shaped sledge drawn by men or oxen, with milk poured on the road as a rite of purification. Relatives followed, while 2 women representing Isis and Nephthys, the divine mourners, knelt at the head and foot of the coffin. In some cases, statues replaced living women. Another sledge carried the canopic jars. Behind them walked groups of women in mourning colors, wailing and striking their bodies, while priests recited prayers and burned incense. Servants followed carrying household items, clothing, furniture, and jewelry meant for the afterlife. At the tomb, musicians and dancers awaited the procession. The opening of the mouth ceremony was performed to restore the senses of the deceased, after which the body was placed in its burial chamber. Mourners then shared a banquet to conclude the rites. From the earliest times, burials were underground, with a mound of sand or stone raised above to protect the body from animals and to mark the site for relatives bringing offerings. Over time, this mound developed into a rectangular brick structure resembling a house, later known as the mastaba. Early royal burials at Abydos even included surrounding chambers filled with provisions and servants who were killed to accompany the king into the afterlife. Though this practice was abandoned early on, Stone replaced mud brick under King Djoser in the 3rd dynasty, whose architect built the first step pyramid by stacking mastaba-like levels. By the 4th dynasty, this evolved into the true pyramid, inspired by the sacred Benben stone of Heliopolis. The pyramid became both tomb and solar symbol, with surrounding mastabas for nobles arranged in an orderly city of the dead. A funerary temple adjoined the pyramid on the east, linked by a causeway to the valley temple. Private tombs also evolved. Access to mastaba chambers was provided by vertical shafts, and a chapel was added for offerings. Here, a false door allowed the spirit to receive food and incense. Later, statues of the deceased were hidden in sealed chambers called sirdabs, where small openings allowed them to see the rituals and smell the incense. By the New Kingdom, rock-cut tombs became common. Their design echoed the layout of an Egyptian house, with a courtyard, pillared halls, and finally a chapel where offerings were made before a statue of the deceased. A shaft led from one of these rooms down to the burial chamber. Though details varied with wealth and taste, these elements remained the foundation of Egyptian tomb architecture throughout the period. Just behind the courtyard and above the rock-cut chambers, a small pyramid of mud brick was often added. Inspired by royal models but far smaller and much steeper, it could also crown chapels of fully built tombs in brick or stone. The pyramid was whitened to imitate limestone, capped with a limestone pyramidion, and on that cap the deceased was shown in relief, worshipping the sun on all 4 sides. A similar scene appeared on a stela set in a niche halfway up the center of the east face. A major shift in royal burial came under Thutmosis I, who abandoned the pyramid altogether and inaugurated the rock-cut tomb in the western Theban desert, now known as the Valley of the Kings. His grave consisted of only 2 modest chambers, but later rulers expanded the concept into deep, branching complexes of corridors and halls that penetrated far into the cliff, ending in a columned chamber housing the stone sarcophagus and grave goods. From Haremhab onward, the main axis of these tombs ran straight. Earlier 18th dynasty tombs often bend leftward, at first in a curve and later at a right angle, for reasons that are unclear, while the tombs of Thutmosis IV and Amenhotep III change direction twice, and that of Tutankhamun turns sharply to the right. Entrances were sealed immediately after burial and soon became indistinguishable among scree and bedrock. Because the narrow valley offered no space for mortuary temples, those were built on the desert flats between the floodplain and the western cliffs, far from the tomb itself. Later dynasties moved royal burials to their political centers. The kings of the 21st dynasty, and afterward at Tanis in the Delta, were interred in crypts beneath a temple floor, and classical authors report that the rulers of the 26th dynasty in Sais did likewise. Great expense and care went into guaranteeing ongoing rites and steady supplies for the dead, believed essential to the unending life of the tomb and of the person within. Family devotion could not be trusted to endure beyond a generation or 2, so Egyptians established legal endowments to fund funerary service. Part of an estate was set aside to finance offerings and maintenance, and the income supported a designated guardian known as the servant of the Ka, who tended the tomb and presented bread, beer, water, and meat before the statue of the deceased. The office, with its duties and revenues, was hereditary. In the Old Kingdom, some owners hired many such priests, but disputes among them led, by the Middle Kingdom, to the practice of appointing a single well-paid servant of the Ka, who could pass the role to only one child, preserving the endowment and the regularity of service. Comparable contracts were made with lector priests to recite the liturgy on set feast days, especially the 1st and 15th of the month. The terms of these agreements were sometimes carved on the tomb walls or stelae, and one priest could hold multiple such contracts, making the care of tombs a profession. Offerings were made on specific dates throughout the year. Besides the monthly observances, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, and the eve and day of the Wag festival in the first month were significant. The ritual included lighting a lamp so the statue could see the meal and the recitation of glorifications. From at least the Middle Kingdom, the king could grant the privilege of placing a private statue in a temple courtyard. Such statues benefited from the prayers and offerings brought to the resident god by visitors, and temple clergy could be contracted to perform rites before them on festivals. In the funerary temples of the 5th dynasty, 2 main categories of priests served the royal cult under instructors. Alongside them, a class of purified officiants called Wab, whose name reflects their ritual ablutions, likely originated at Heliopolis in the service of Re and spread with the solar cult into royal and provincial worship. One 5th dynasty sun temple survives at Abusir, that of Nusera, revealing a layout unlike later temples. A covered causeway rose from a valley gate to the desert platform. The complex centered on a vast court facing east, with a massive stone pedestal on the west carrying a limestone obelisk and an alabaster altar of 5 blocks to the east. A slaughter court with runnels and basins occupied the north. Storerooms lined the north side, and a vestry at the obelisk's base led up to a viewing platform. South of the temple lay a large wooden boat set on a brick cradle, a tangible stand-in for the solar bark. No trace of its companion was found. The open court and skyward-pointing obelisk announced the temple's purpose: to receive the sun's rays at dawn, the apex serving as the god's seat, recalling the Benben of Heliopolis, where Re was not represented by a statue. By the Middle and New Kingdoms, most temples mirrored elite houses or palaces, reflecting the distinctly human way Egyptians conceived their gods. Within a high mud brick enclosure wall stood a monumental pylon gateway. Beyond stretched a colonnaded court, sometimes centered on an altar, a solar innovation. Next came a broad but shallow hypostyle hall lit by high clear-story windows, and finally the long, narrow, windowless sanctuary, the god's private chamber. The divine image rested within a shrine set upon a bark, all around which clustered treasuries and storerooms for food, linen, and oils. Between the temple and its enclosure were priests' quarters, workshops, gardens, and a sacred lake for purification. Founding a temple began with the extending of the measuring cord. The king, or in his stead, the chief lector, priest, and scribe of sacred texts, aided by deities such as Seshat, marked the 4 corners with stakes and joined them by cord after orienting the short axis north-south by the stars, particularly the Great Bear and Orion, during a nocturnal observation. Offerings of a goose's head and a bull's head were placed in a pit and purified with water poured from globular vessels while the king knelt. He then molded 4 foundation bricks, one for each corner, filling a wooden frame with mud by hand to inaugurate the new divine house. When the foundations of a temple were prepared, the king performed a ritual in which he dug a trench along the 4 sides of the planned building with a wooden hoe until he reached the groundwater filtering through from the Nile. This trench was then filled with sand mixed with pottery sherds, a technique designed to guard the walls from seepage. At the end of the ceremony, The king laid the first bricks at each corner, while symbolic foundation, deposits, small models of tools used by brickmakers and carpenters, were buried beneath the walls. This ancient rite clearly belonged to a time when temples were built of mud brick and wood, before stone construction became common. When the building was completed, another rite followed. The king, holding a staff and a mace, symbolically whitewashed the temple with chalk, signifying purification. The temple was then officially dedicated to its god, a dedication renewed annually on New Year's Eve, when lamps were lit and the sanctuary was ceremonially returned to its master. Another act of consecration, the opening of the mouth, was performed not only on statues but throughout the temple itself, endowing the structure, its reliefs, and furnishings with a form of divine vitality. These powers were sustained by the daily rituals, and the formulae of the consecration were carved into the temple walls. Once consecration was complete, a feast was held for the craftsmen and priests who had built and decorated the sanctuary. Depictions inside temples show only the king in direct contact with the gods. As a divine being, or the son of a god, he was represented as the sole intermediary between humans and deities. Yet this image was largely symbolic. While in very early times, a local ruler may have personally served as the priest of his city's god, in the unified kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt, it was impossible for one man to perform all religious duties himself. Thus, priests were appointed to act in his place. Local traditions produced a wide range of priestly titles, many of which survived into later history. The chief priest of Re was called Greatest of the Seers. The high priest of Ta bore the title Greatest of the Directors of Crafts, and the high priest of Thoth at Hermopolis was styled Greatest of Five in the House of Thoth. The usual word for priest was hem, servant, later expanded to hem-netcher, servant of the god. Alongside them were the Wab, pure ones, probably originating in the sun cult, and a group called Fathers of the God, whose precise role is still uncertain. In the Old and Middle Kingdoms, priests resembled civil officials and were appointed directly by the king. Only in the New Kingdom did the priesthood become a hereditary class. At that time, the hem-netcher were professional priests, while the Wab were laymen entrusted with carrying the divine statue during public ceremonies. The Greeks later translated hem-netcher as prophets, emphasizing their role in declaring the god's will, while Wab were equated with hiereus, though their functions were closer to pastophoroi, carriers of sacred shrines. This division of professional clergy and lay assistants lasted until Christian times, when the Coptic word for priest, hont, derived from hem-netcher, referred only to pagan clergy, while Wab was also used for Christian priests, suggesting that Christianity may have drawn many of its early leaders from among the lay class. Within ritual, the chief officiant was the hem-netcher, while sacred texts were recited by the lector priest, or kerheb, the keeper of the ritual book. Another group, the sem priests, were less prominent, silent attendants who carried offerings and raised their arms in fixed gestures. Records from Illahun provide a glimpse into the administration of Senwosret III's mortuary temple. Permanent staff included officials such as the chief servant of the god, a herald, master of mysteries, wardrobe keeper, overseer of the wide hall, overseer of the chapel of the Kai, temple scribes, altar scribes, and the lector priest. The larger body of priests, called hour priests, was divided into 4 groups, or philes, each serving for a month in rotation, completing 3 months of service annually. A fifth file was added only in Ptolemaic times. The influence of priesthoods depended on the wealth of their temples. None grew more powerful than the clergy of Amun during the New Kingdom. Headed by the first prophet of Amun, they accumulated such power that by the 21st dynasty they effectively ruled Thebes and its surroundings as a state within a state. Nominally, the realm belonged to Amun, but in practice the high priests themselves held authority, taking royal titles, writing their names in cartouches, and exercising near-monarchical control while still acknowledging the Tanite kings in theory. Temple revenues were drawn from taxes in their districts, royal gifts of land, cattle, and captives, and shares of war booty. By the early 20th dynasty, the Temple of Amun controlled about a fifth of Egypt's farmland, making it an immense economic and political force. Royal decrees also granted temples exemption from taxes, freed their priests and dependents from labor on royal lands, and placed their estates beyond the reach of state officials. In principle, all temple income, food, drink, linen, perfumes, belonged to the god and was offered to him. Yet after the deity was ritually satisfied, these goods were distributed among the clergy and temple workers. Egyptians, being practical, did not normally destroy offerings by fire. On occasion, however, animals such as gazelles, geese, and goats were burned, representing the annihilation of the god's enemies. The ritual of placing a furnace may preserve an echo of early funerary practices, and the same animals appear in the ancient rite of the opening of the mouth. Priestly purity was a defining mark of their office. It was achieved through frequent ablutions, chewing natron, and removing body hair. Complete shaving of the head became common only in the New Kingdom. Their clothing remained conservative, and they avoided certain foods, especially fish, as part of their discipline. Women did not take part in the core temple liturgy. Their sphere was music, song, and dance inside the sanctuary precincts and during public appearances of the god in processions. As priests served the deity, these musicians embodied the divine household, and their leader was treated as the god's consort. That role was consistently linked to Hathor, long viewed as the spouse of the sun god within the Heliopolitan tradition. In Thebes, the high priestess of Amun bore the title God's Wife, and from the 23rd through the 26th dynasties, a succession of these royal women effectively governed the Theban clerical domain. The daily rites themselves unfolded behind screens, out of sight in the innermost chamber, with only a small priestly cadre admitted. Ordinary people could go no farther than the open court to pour water as a libation and utter a prayer. Their best chance to approach a deity came during the festivals of coming forth, when a statue left its shrine and toured the city or traveled to another center. At first, these outings reflected the simple idea that a god, like a person, might enjoy an excursion. Later, they were framed as reenactments of episodes from sacred history. Some were strictly local, while others drew pilgrims from far afield, as lively accounts of Bubastis attest. Festival dates might follow the agricultural cycle or the fixed civil calendar, depending on the nature of the deity. Several celebrations of Min, the god of fertility, took place across Egypt, the most prominent at the start of the harvest. Priests carried his image under a great canopy marked with royal names, with lettuce bearers following, and a white bull led in the train, along with royal effigies and divine standards. When the god was seated on the stepped throne beneath a baldachin, offerings were presented, a first ear of grain was cut, and 4 birds were released towards the cardinal points carrying written proclamations. two beloved Theban feasts, though local in origin, became so famous that their months later took their names. The festival of Opet began on day 19 of the second month, and in the time of Rameses, the third lasted 27 days. Amun, Mut, and Khons journeyed by river from Karnak to Luxor and back, their barks towed in procession, while incense smoldered and fans waved overhead. Crowds lined the banks and accompanied the cortege on land, and on arrival at Luxor offerings were made, especially prime oxen, before the gods rested in side chapels. They returned to Karnak in the same stately order. During the Feast of the Valley in the 10th month, Amun crossed to the west bank to visit royal mortuary temples and pour water for the kings, with the valley of Deir el-Bahri, home to Hatshepsut's sanctuary and a cult of Hathor, as the final goal. Some processions included staged episodes from myth in the spirit of mystery plays. The best known were those of Osiris at Abydos. An inscription by the chief treasurer Ikernofrit describes a cycle beginning with the appearance of Upuat to clear the way, followed by Osiris in his sacred bark striking down foes, while participants enacted skirmishes with the enemy party. A great going forth led to the slaying of the god by Setek, followed by days of public mourning. The adorned figure of Osiris was then borne for burial to the district of Pikr, southeast of the temple, where his tomb was believed to be. Offerings and wreaths were shared among the faithful, and at Nedet, a second clash dramatized the overthrow of Setek. Finally, the bark returned with a victorious Osiris to jubilant acclaim. Not every deity was displayed openly. Min's image could be seen by all, but Amun, Mut, and Khons were carried within small wooden shrines mounted on their barks, the doorway concealed by a curtain. Even so, worshippers felt close enough to present petitions as the procession paused, and the god's response was treated as an oracle. Certain days honored the dead with offerings, lamps, and hymns recited before statues, either placed by privilege within temples to share in divine rites or installed in tomb chapels under the care of mortuary priests. These observances clustered around the close and opening of the year, notably the first epagomenal day, New Year's Eve and Day, and the Wag festival. No survey of Egyptian festivals is complete without the ancient Sed festival, often misunderstood in modern speculation. Its roots reach back to the dawn of the monarchy. Some rulers held it after 30 years on the throne and then at 3-year intervals, while others celebrated earlier, perhaps counting from their designation as crown prince. At heart, it was a periodic renewal of kingship that symbolically reenacted the unification of the two lands, first achieved by Mens and ritually affirmed at accession. Memphis was its traditional stage, and in the Ramesside era it fell under the patronage of Ptah, with deities and clergy summoned from across Egypt to salute the Jubilee. Images or emblems of the visiting gods stood in twin rows of chapels flanking a great court. A special festival court featured 2 lofty thrones beneath a canopy on a high platform reached by twin stairways, while a temporary palace provided rooms for the king's changes of attire. The observances seem to have opened on the first day of the 4th month, though the full length is unknown. The king was the central figure. The queen did not officiate. He began on foot with offerings to the local gods. In the next rite, he processed to the double throne, preceded by the standard of Upuaut of Siut, a potent emblem linked to the earliest campaigns that forged unity. Seating himself in turn on each throne, he reenacted the dual coronation and received the acclamation of his people and the blessings of the gods through their priests, returning honors with gifts to the sanctuaries. At the height of the Jubilee festival, the king performed the offering dance, considered its most important moment. Removing his cloak, he appeared in a short kilt with an animal's tail attached, the crown of Upper Egypt on his head, and a short scepter and whisk in his hands. He then ran 4 ritual courses, presenting his royal insignia to the god Upuaut. In the closing stage, a palanquin was brought forward. The king, now wrapped in a finely woven cloak, mounted it and was carried in a grand procession to visit the chapels of Horus and Set. These gods presented him with 4 arrows of victory, which he aimed towards the 4 directions of the world as a symbolic act of striking down his enemies. A key feature of Egyptian religion was its tolerance. As in most polytheistic systems, there was room for foreign deities, just as there was for foreign peoples settling in the land. Yet during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, only one foreign god seems to have gained acceptance. Neighboring regions such as Nubia, Libya, Sinai, and southern Palestine did not present divinities powerful or impressive enough to stand alongside the established gods of Egypt. The sole exception was Dedun, a Nubian god linked with incense. He is described in the pyramid inscriptions of the 6th dynasty as the youth of Upper Egypt who has come from Nubia. His name does not appear in earlier 5th dynasty texts, suggesting that he entered the Egyptian pantheon around the 6th dynasty, at a time when Nubia played a vital role in long-distance trade. Dedun later appeared on monuments, though only south of Thebes, and never achieved prominence farther north. Another figure sometimes associated with foreign lands was the god Ash, occasionally linked to Libya. He is mentioned as early as the 2nd dynasty, and later called Lord of Libya, though he was likely a local deity of a frontier district, much like Neith of Sais was tied to Libya and Sopt of the eastern delta to the Asiatic borderlands. When Egyptians encountered foreign gods abroad, they tended to identify them with their own deities. Female divinities, especially those of the sky, were commonly equated with Hathor. In Byblos, traders referred to the local goddess as Hathor, Lady of Byblos, patroness of sailors. In Sinai, she became Hathor, Lady of the Turquoise, reflecting the minerals sought there. These forms of Hathor became popular back in Egypt as well. Warlike male gods of Syria and Palestine were often seen as versions of Setek, Horus's rival. While one myth gave Setek control over Upper Egypt, another tradition allotted him all the foreign Red Lands, in contrast to Horus's rule over the Black Land of Egypt. No evidence suggests that Egyptian gods were established in temples outside Egypt before the end of the Middle Kingdom, apart from Nubia. When the kings of the 12th dynasty extended their rule there, they built fortresses, settlements, and temples, bringing Khnum of the Cataract region into worship alongside the local Dedun. In the New Kingdom, however, foreign gods entered Egypt in great numbers. The conquests of the 18th dynasty created an empire in Asia that reached at times as far as the Euphrates. Egyptians encountered Semitic city-states rich in Babylonian influence, each with its own Baal, lord, or Baalat, mistress. Prisoners of war, slaves, traders, and soldiers brought their native cults into Egypt, establishing shrines and temples. Egyptian society itself began adopting Asiatic customs, absorbing Semitic words and deities. Among the most prominent were Reshep, Ershop, Mikal, Astarte, Anat, Kadesh, and Kedeshet, whose worship spread widely. Pharaohs themselves embraced these gods. In Egypt, the king was always depicted as the child of the local deity. This idea was extended to sanctuaries in conquered territories. Amenhotep II was described as beloved of Reshep and blessed by Astarte, while Rameses II was shown as the foster son of Anat, with her hand on his shoulder declaring herself his mother. Rameses III referred to Anat and Astarte as his protective shields. Even the comparison of Thutmosis IV to Astarte as a strong horseman reflects this identification. Egyptian officials followed suit. At Bethshan in Palestine, an Egyptian erected a stela to Mikal, Lord of Bethshan. Another dedicated a monument to Astarte, and still another to Anat. At Ras Shamra in Syria, an Egyptian set up a stela for Baal Zephon. The center of Asiatic worship in Egypt was Memphis. By the 18th dynasty, a district of the city was known as the Quarter of the Hittites, and later as the Camp of the Tyrians, seat of the foreign goddess Astarte. Egyptian papyri list alongside native gods such foreign divinities as Baalat, Keteshet, Anat, and Baal Zephon. Their proximity to the great temple of Ptah even led to reinterpretations. Astarte was called daughter of Ptah in one tale, and both Anat and Astarte became daughters of Re. Reshep was given the title, He Who Listens to Prayers, a role otherwise reserved for Ptah. Despite Egyptian reinterpretations, these gods retained their foreign appearance in art. Reshep wore a tall conical cap with tassel, wielding shield, spear, and mace. Astarte carried arms and appeared on horseback, a custom alien to Egypt. Keteshet stood unclothed on a lion, holding flowers and a snake. Priests of these deities are attested at Memphis, the earliest known being a Syrian from Zirbashan, who served as prophet of Baal and Astarte during the reign of Amenhotep IV. Rameses II appears to have been an especially devoted follower of the goddess Anat. He not only gave her name to his horses, but also named his beloved daughter Bint Anat, meaning daughter of Anat. In his new delta capital at Per Rames, later known as Tanis, he introduced Anat's cult and even built her a temple. At the same site, he was also linked to the Semitic god Horon, represented as a falcon and later associated in Memphis with the Great Sphinx. The worship of foreign deities in Egypt was not limited to Memphis or the Ramesside Delta capital. The god Reshep is recorded as far south as Nubia, in a rock inscription near Toshka, and together with Anat and Kadesh, he became popular among the workers of the Theban necropolis. Astarte, known as Ishtar in Mesopotamia, was famed in Nineveh for her healing powers, and she too entered Egypt. This introduction is documented in a cuneiform letter from Tushratta, king of Mitanni, to his son-in-law Amenhotep III. The letter, dated to the king's 36th year, explains that the statue of Ishtar of Nineveh was sent to Egypt to aid Amenhotep during a severe illness. Evidence suggests that the statue remained there, since a later stela, now in Copenhagen, shows an Egyptian named Rome dedicating it to Ishtar, likely seeking a cure for his club foot. While the Egyptians eagerly welcomed Semitic deities, their subjects in Syria and Palestine did not embrace Egyptian gods in the same way. Temples to Amun or other Egyptian deities were built in those lands, and artifacts confirming Egyptian religious presence have been uncovered, but these dedications were almost always made by Egyptian officials or soldiers stationed abroad. There is no clear case of local communities adopting Egyptian gods as their own. Still, Egyptian deities commanded respect. Even at the close of the 20th dynasty, when Egyptian control in Asia had nearly vanished, the king of Byblos acknowledged Amun's power when speaking with Wenamun, envoy of Amun's high priest at Thebes. The king remarked that Amun had provided for all lands, beginning with Egypt, and that from Egypt had come the skills and learning that enriched Byblos. Inside Egypt, however, the presence of foreign gods left little impact on native religious thought. Once Egypt lost its Asian empire, their popularity quickly faded. The quarter in Memphis where Asiatic gods were worshipped endured into Ptolemaic times under the name Astartean, but for the most part their names disappeared from Egyptian memory, surviving only in a few isolated offering scenes to Anat, or Astarte, likely copied from older traditions. To the west, Egyptian religion spread into the desert oases. Setek, regarded as lord of foreign lands, had early sanctuaries in these regions, and his oracle at Daklek was still active in the 22nd dynasty. Yet in the great oasis of Siwa, the cult of Amun became dominant, leading to its later fame in the classical world as the sanctuary of Jupiter Amun. By the Persian period, temples to Amun existed in both El Karga and Siwa, though his worship there must have begun centuries earlier. The oracle's fame stretched across the Mediterranean, and in 332 BCE, Alexander the Great made a pilgrimage to Siwa after conquering Egypt. There, the priests hailed him as the son of Amun, shaping his vision of kingship and his future role as world conqueror. Later legend held that his victories were assured by the oracle's promise. In Nubia and the Sudan, Egyptian religion achieved its deepest and most lasting influence. The first conquest of the 12th dynasty extended Egypt's frontier to the Second Cataract, where Egyptians encountered pastoral tribes of limited development. Their local deity Daedon was incorporated into Egyptian practice, but the conquerors also introduced their own gods, notably the triad of Elephantine, Khnum, Satet, and Anuket. Although Nubia was lost in the Second Intermediate Period, it was reconquered at the start of the 18th dynasty, and Egyptian authority extended farther south. The favored divinity in these regions was Horus, the divine embodiment of kingship, and each major town worshipped its own form of Horus, such as Horus of Buin, Horus of Mayam, and Horus of Baki. Alongside this, the cults of specific Egyptian kings flourished more strongly in Nubia than in Egypt itself. Senwosret III, remembered as the first conqueror, was worshipped in the fortresses of Semneh and Kumneh. Thutmosis III, Amenhotep III, and his queen Tiye, Tutankhamun, and Ramesses II also received worship in Nubia. Yet above all, the great gods Amun of Thebes, Re-Herakti of Heliopolis, and Ptah of Memphis dominated the religious landscape. Thutmosis III built a temple dedicated to Amun, lord of the thrones of the two lands, far to the south at Napata, the site of modern Gebel Barkal. This sacred place lay beneath a striking flat-topped mountain that rose sharply from the plain near the Nile, a peak the Egyptians revered as the Pure Mountain. The priests of Thebes proclaimed that Amun's power extended over all of Nubia, just as they claimed supremacy for Amun of Karnak over Egypt and its foreign territories. In time, the region was fully colonized, and Nubia outwardly adopted Egyptian culture, though it is uncertain how deeply these changes influenced the nomadic population. When Nubia eventually slipped from Egyptian control, likely during the era when Amun's high priests ruled Thebes as a religious state in the 21st dynasty, a shift occurred. That theocracy in Egypt collapsed and was replaced by a military regime organized at Bubastis by rulers of Libyan descent. Meanwhile, Napata emerged as the capital of a new Ethiopian kingdom. There, the priests of Amun maintained a theocracy in which the god's oracle chose kings and guided their decisions. Around 730 BCE, following the command of Amun, King Pianki led an expedition into a politically fragmented Egypt. He conquered the land, carefully respecting its temples, personally attending festivals, making offerings, and observing Egyptian rituals. Pianki regarded himself as a true Egyptian and dismissed the native rulers as impure. This reflected the Ethiopian view of themselves as the guardians of authentic Egyptian religion and civilization, a belief that deeply impressed later Greek writers who considered the Ethiopians the most devout and wise people, imagining their land to be the cradle of Egyptian culture, the opposite of reality. Although Pianki's control did not last, his successor Shabaka again seized Egypt, founding the 25th dynasty of Ethiopian kings. These rulers and their queens were buried in pyramids at Napata, their tombs clearly modeled on Egyptian traditions. Their steep-sided pyramids contained mummies, canopic jars, scarabs, ushebtis, and sarcophagi, all decorated with hieroglyphic inscriptions and funerary scenes of Osiris, Isis, Anubis, and Amun-Re. The official religion of Ethiopia was, in essence, Egyptian, though whether the entire population shared in these beliefs remains uncertain. When Psammetichus I restored Egypt's independence in 663 BCE, ties with Ethiopia were permanently broken. Later, in the 3rd century BCE, the Ethiopian capital moved to Meroe, north of modern Khartoum, and over time, the culture and religion of the region declined into a more barbarized form. Back in Egypt, the peak of Amun's authority had come with the Theban priestly state. But from then onward, the religion slowly weakened, mirroring the country's political and cultural decline. The 22nd dynasty of Bubastis, founded by Libyan mercenary leaders, transformed Egypt into a military state. Though its rulers styled themselves as beloved of Amun, their main devotion was to Bastet of Bubastis and to other delta gods closer to their capital. They secured influence in Thebes by appointing their sons as high priests of Amun. But by then, the true authority in Thebes lay with the god's wife of Amun, a priestly office held by royal women that had been established in the 18th dynasty. By the 22nd dynasty, this institution often outweighed even the high priesthood itself. The Ethiopian conquest and the establishment of the 25th dynasty seemed for a time to restore Amun's greatness, for the Ethiopian kings were themselves fervent worshippers of Amun of Napata. Yet in 663 BCE, during the conflict between Tanutamun of Ethiopia and Assurbanipal of Assyria, Thebes was sacked and its temples destroyed. Tanutamun soon retreated to Ethiopia and never returned, leaving Amun reduced to little more than a local deity. Even under the succeeding native rulers of the 26th dynasty, who rose from Sais in the Delta, Amun never regained his former status. Neith of Sais became the chief state goddess. Thebes declined into provincial obscurity, and the title of God's Wife of Amun was absorbed into the site royal house when Psammetichus I compelled Shepenwepet, daughter of Pianki, to adopt his own daughter Nitocre as heir to the role. The Egyptians, troubled by their political fragmentation and cultural decline, sought solutions in a return to the past. The Ethiopian kings had already attempted to restore unity by presenting themselves as heirs to the ancient pharaohs. In religion and art, they deliberately looked back to the Old Kingdom as their model, considering that age more pure than the later New Kingdom, which had been heavily influenced by Asia. This deliberate archasing spirit gave Egyptian life in its final centuries the distinctly ancient character that so impressed the Greeks and filled them with admiration. During the rule of the native 26th dynasty, Egypt entered what has often been called a renaissance. Outwardly, the kingdom resembled the age of the pyramid builders, reviving old styles and traditions with great success. Yet beneath this facade, the state was militarily and economically weak. Psammetichus I and his successors depended heavily on Greek support. Greek mercenaries defended frontier strongholds, while Greek merchants were granted a trading enclave at Naucratis in the Delta. Despite their presence, these allies could not protect Egypt from falling to the Persians in 525 BCE. Greek traders may even have seen advantages in the conquest, since Persian rule opened wider commercial opportunities and freed them from restrictions previously imposed in Egypt. The Persians, for their part, interfered little with native institutions. They stationed garrisons, levied taxes, and showed tolerance toward religion. Indeed, the Temple of Amun at El Karge was built under Darius I, with his name inscribed upon it. The attitude of early Greek settlers toward Egyptian religion remains partly obscure. Herodotus records that Amasis granted places for foreign sailors to build altars and sanctuaries, indicating that Greeks were free to worship their own gods. Excavations at Naucratis confirm this, revealing temples dedicated to Apollo, Hera, Aphrodite, the Dioscoroi, and a large Hellenion founded by several Ionian cities, with literary sources also mentioning a temple of Zeus. No sanctuary of an Egyptian deity has been discovered there, nor much evidence that Greeks adopted Egyptian gods, though an inscription suggests the worship of Isis by the 5th century BCE. While Greek merchants appear to have been indifferent, Greek intellectuals visiting Egypt were fascinated. Herodotus himself devoted the whole of his second book to describing Egyptian cults, myths, and rituals, often drawing parallels with Greek deities. Osiris became Dionysus, Horus Apollo, Bastet Artemis, Isis Demeter, and Amun Zeus. Many Egyptian gods were known to him only by their supposed Greek equivalents, names which he believed the Greeks had originally borrowed from Egypt. Less fortunate than the Greeks were the Jewish mercenaries settled at Elephantine, who served in the garrison guarding Egypt's southern frontier from the 26th dynasty onward. They maintained a temple to Yahweh alongside two female deities, Ashima and Anat, forms of worship still tolerated before the centralization of Judaism in Jerusalem in 515 BC. Their temple was respected under Persian rule, but tensions with local Egyptians sometimes flared. In 410 BC, with the consent of the Persian commander, priests of Khnum led an attack that destroyed the Jewish sanctuary. Though the commander was later executed, the community struggled for years to gain permission to rebuild and may never have succeeded before Egypt regained independence in 405 BC, likely canceling any authorization. A major shift came with Alexander's conquest of Egypt in 332 BC. From that moment, Greeks were no longer mere settlers, but the ruling class, arriving in ever greater numbers. Alexandria, newly founded, became a wholly Greek city and the intellectual center of the Hellenistic world. Elsewhere, however, Greeks lived among a vast native majority, and the two traditions inevitably met. At Hermopolis, burials show a blend of Greek and Egyptian elements from the 3rd century BC through Roman times. Greek myths painted on walls sit alongside scenes of Horus and Thoth. The Greeks who settled at Memphis encountered the flourishing cult of the Apis bull, closely linked with Osiris, and adopted him as Osirapis. Worship of Isis and Anubis soon followed. Ptolemy I, eager to unite his Greek and Egyptian subjects, elevated this cult into the central state religion. Guided by the Greek Timotheus and the Egyptian Manetho, he sanctioned the creation of a new god, Serapis, whose statue was brought from Sinope and installed in Alexandria. Though Egyptian in name and origin, Serapis was presented in Greek style, a bearded, cloaked figure resembling Pluto, seated on a throne with Cerberus at his feet. His temple, the Serapeum, soon became one of the grandest sanctuaries in Egypt. Serapis, also called Usar-Hape by the Egyptians, quickly rose in popularity among both peoples, becoming the official deity of the Ptolemaic realm. His triumph is best understood in light of a deeper change already underway. Osiris, once confined to ruling the dead, had gradually extended his power into the world of the living. By this period, names invoking Osiris were common, and the Apis bull, once linked with Ptah, had merged so fully with Osiris after death that the two became indistinguishable. The spread of Serapis was therefore not only a political act, but the culmination of centuries of religious transformation in which Osiris and the cycle of life and death he embodied had come to dominate Egyptian belief. As the influence of Osiris grew, the cult of the sun god Re gradually faded, his identity merging more and more with that of Osiris. Already by the 20th dynasty, scribes began to use the symbol of the sun disk in place of the traditional hieroglyph of the eye when writing the latter part of Osiris's name, showing that Osiris was beginning to embody solar qualities. By the Ptolemaic era, Re had almost disappeared as an independent figure, his role entirely absorbed by Osiris. What had been hinted at in earlier texts, that Osiris would take the throne of Re, was now a reality. Alongside him, Isis rose to the highest rank among goddesses, while their son, Horus the Child, though stripped of much of his old solar nature, enjoyed great popularity. Egyptian gods began to appear in the Greek world by the late 4th century BC. Traders from Egypt brought with them the cults of Isis and Amun to the Piraeus, and soon afterward, Egyptian deities were found in the islands and coastal towns of Asia Minor. Under the early Ptolemies, these cults spread more widely, supported by officials who promoted Egyptian influence abroad. Temples to Serapis appeared at places like Miletus and Halicarnassus, while private associations in Greece itself began to honor Isis and Serapis. Their worship was public in the Aegean Islands and in Asia, reflecting both local devotion and Ptolemaic political patronage. Retiring officials and soldiers also carried these cults back to their native cities, ensuring that the Egyptian gods took root far beyond the Nile Valley. By the 2nd century BC, Isis and Serapis had established a strong presence in Athens, with Isis even appearing on coinage. By the time Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BC, the gods of Egypt were already firmly embedded throughout Greece and beyond. Their advance into the western Mediterranean followed quickly. Serapis was brought to Sicily by Agathocles, and Egyptian cults appeared in southern Italy from the 2nd century BC onward. In Rome itself, priests of Osiris are attested during the age of Sulla, though official resistance to these foreign deities was strong. Several attempts were made to ban Isis and her companions between 58 and 48 BCE, and even Augustus and Tiberius were hesitant, seeing in Isis a symbol of their enemy Cleopatra. In 21 BC, Agrippa prohibited the worship of Isis within a mile of the city, but over time the restrictions eased. By the reign of Caligula, Isis had a temple on the Campus Martius, and later emperors expanded her cult further. Vespasian and Domitian honored Isis and Serapis, and Caracalla finally built a grand temple for Isis on the Quirinal. From Rome, Egyptian cults spread across the empire. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, There was hardly a province without shrines to Isis or Serapis. Soldiers carried their devotion with them from one posting to another, while merchants, slaves, and officials helped to spread the faith even to the edges of the known world. There was even a sanctuary to Isis in Roman Britain. Over time, the Egyptian deities shed much of their original local identity and absorbed new traits through association with Greek and Roman gods. By the 3rd century, Serapis was increasingly seen as a sun god, while Isis became linked with the powers of the earth and the sea, serving as a patroness of sailors. Her festival of navigation, celebrated each March in Rome with a statue carried in a boat mounted on a cart, echoed the ancient processions of Egypt and left traces in later European traditions of carnival. The enduring appeal of these gods lay partly in their exotic character and partly in the sense of mystery that surrounded them. Their rituals and symbols were striking, their promises compelling. Unlike the cold, distant figures of the classical pantheon, the Egyptian gods were seen as closer to human concerns, offering comfort and, above all, the promise of life after death for those who lived justly. This clear assurance of immortality was something Greek and Roman religion could never provide with certainty. And it was this promise, as much as political patronage or cultural fashion, that secured the Egyptian deities a place in the religious life of the Roman world until the very end of paganism. In the later Roman Empire, the priesthood of Egyptian deities was largely made up of professionals, many of whom were themselves of Egyptian origin. One such figure, Harnufis, served not only in Egypt but also alongside the Roman army during the Marcomannic Wars. At Aquileia, he and a Roman citizen dedicated an altar to Isis, and he was credited with invoking Hermes of the air, a Greek name for the Egyptian god Shu, to bring about the miraculous rain that saved a division of Marcus Aurelius' troops in 174 CE. The inscription there describes him as an Egyptian scholar, reflecting how the traditions of Egypt traveled far beyond the Nile Valley. Meanwhile, within Egypt itself, the native gods steadily regained dominance over the Greek ones. Egyptians found in their religion, language, and customs a way to safeguard their national identity. They had little reason to resist the cult of Serapis, since to them he was simply their own Osiris Apis under a new form, while Greeks embraced him largely to win favor with rulers and gain access to high positions. By the 2nd century CE, Serapeums were reported throughout the land, one in each nome, showing how firmly established the god had become. In Egyptian texts, he was consistently written as Usar-Hape, and Egyptian documents rarely used Greek divine names. Even when proper names derived from Greek gods appeared, they were often translated into Egyptian equivalents. Conversely, while Greeks sometimes used native names in their own records, the Egyptians held firmly to their traditions, keeping Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Anubis in their own forms. Some Egyptian figures, like Imhotep, were even adopted into Greek tradition as Asclepios, showing a blending of traditions, though always rooted in Egyptian origins. From the 3rd century BC onward, especially after the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC, the influence of the native priesthood grew significantly. Ptolemy IV, lacking enough Greek manpower, armed large numbers of Egyptians who proved crucial in battle and gained new confidence. This empowerment led to frequent uprisings, particularly in Upper Egypt, where local rulers maintained independence for nearly 2 decades. Egyptians were also increasingly admitted to posts in the army and administration, further strengthening native identity. To secure loyalty, later Ptolemies granted temples special privileges, including tax remissions, state-financed burials of sacred bulls, and widespread rites of asylum, which greatly expanded priestly power. Greeks, by this stage, had become deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious life, often serving as guarantors for temple petitions. Unlike Alexandria and the few Greek-founded cities such as Naucratis and Ptolemais, most of Egypt remained overwhelmingly Egyptian in population, architecture, and culture. Greek temples were few and small, while grand new sanctuaries dedicated to Egyptian gods were raised across the land during Ptolemaic times, many of which still stand as some of the best preserved monuments of antiquity. The Temple of Horus at Edfu, begun under Ptolemy III and completed under Ptolemy XIII, is a striking example. Others include the temples of Hathor at Dendera, Sobek and Haro-Eris at Kom Ombo, Khnum at Esna, and Isis at Philae, along with many smaller sanctuaries dedicated to ancient deities and deified sages. These projects not only reflected the continuing vitality of the native cults, but also revealed how far the Greeks themselves had been absorbed into the religious world of Egypt. The reliefs and inscriptions that cover the walls of Greco-Roman temples reveal little that is new. They are largely faithful reproductions of older religious texts, rediscovered in temple archives, with only minor adjustments to spelling or artistic style. For scholars today, they provide valuable insight into earlier stages of Egyptian religion, yet they offer almost nothing about the actual beliefs of the later period. The same lack of originality is evident in funerary literature. Works such as the Book of Breathings and the Book of Traversing Eternity, both from around the 1st century BCE, were not innovative compositions, but compilations of phrases from older texts. What truly defined the late development of Egyptian religion was the resurgence and expansion of animal worship. Priests deliberately emphasized this archaic feature of their tradition as a way of resisting foreign influences, particularly Greek culture. Since Egyptians had always lived in close connection with animals, this form of worship resonated deeply with ordinary people and was practiced with fervor. Accounts describe severe punishments for harming sacred animals. While killing most sacred species brought the death penalty, killing a cat or an ibis, even by accident, was likely to provoke mob violence. The rivalry between towns over their chosen sacred creatures sometimes turned violent, as in the fierce clashes between Ombos and Tentira, vividly remembered in later satire. Surprisingly, even Greeks who adopted Egyptian gods sometimes included animal cults, with the crocodile of Sobek becoming especially prominent in the Fayum. Yet educated Greek observers often criticized this practice, arguing that divine power was beyond physical form and could not be captured by animal or human likeness. In this same period, large deities often fragmented into many local manifestations. Sobek of Crocodilopolis, for instance, gave rise to regional forms such as Soknopaios or Soknebtinus, each worshipped in nearby villages. While earlier rulers had worked to unify religious practices, these divisions served foreign authorities well, as they prevented Egyptians from uniting under one religious identity. When Octavian took Egypt in 30 BC, Greeks in the country retained their privileged status as a ruling minority. Rome, unlike earlier conquerors, had little cultural ambition there. Its interest was mainly economic. For the Egyptian people, Roman rule meant little more than replacing one foreign master with another. Still, the Roman emperor was accepted as divine, just as Macedonian rulers had been before, and Egyptian concepts of kingship helped shape the emperor's own claim to sacred authority throughout the empire. Christianity began to take root in Egypt during the 1st century CE, most likely arriving through Alexandria with connections to the city's large Jewish community. At first, it spread slowly, since the movement was originally focused on renewing the Jewish people rather than converting outsiders. Christians were often confused with Jews, and only gradually did their faith extend to non-Jews, helped by the work of figures like Paul. Over time, Christianity in Egypt also gained momentum through opposition to imperial authority. The refusal to honor the emperor as divine placed Christians in conflict with Roman power and led to periodic persecutions. Yet these persecutions only deepened Christianity's appeal, particularly among the lower classes burdened by harsh taxation and exploitation. Though scholars sometimes debate whether early Christianity was directly influenced by Egyptian religion, what can be said is that Egypt provided part of the broader cultural soil in which it flourished. Egyptian thought had long emphasized moral conduct, purity, the unity of the divine, and hope in life after death, ideas that resonated with the Christian message. The parallel between the resurrection of Christ and the myth of Osiris would not have been lost on the Egyptian imagination. At the same time, Christianity introduced new and compelling elements that made it especially attractive to the poor and marginalized. Love among believers, rejection of worldly wealth, generosity to the needy, and the assurance of divine grace that enabled one to live faithfully. Most importantly, the death of God was redefined not merely as a stage in the eternal conflict of good and evil, but as an act of redemption for humanity itself. This elevated the worth of each individual to a level never before imagined, and gave Christianity the strength to spread rapidly through Egypt and beyond. As Christianity spread and gathered larger numbers of followers, it inevitably absorbed elements of older pagan traditions. The image of the Virgin Mary holding the infant Jesus, for instance, echoes the long familiar depictions of Isis with the child Horus on her lap. The rise of local saints, the building of their shrines, the pilgrimages to these holy sites, and the festivals surrounding them were in many ways a continuation of the cult of earlier local deities. Even St. George slaying the dragon bears a striking resemblance to Horus spearing Setek, often shown in the form of a crocodile. The celebration of Christmas on December 25th likewise reflects the ancient solar festival of the birth of Ra. Astrology and magical practices, though long forbidden, returned under Christian guise, with spells and charms almost identical to the old ones, except that the names of Egyptian gods were replaced with those of Christ or the saints, who were sometimes even commanded to obey. By the end of the 2nd century, Christianity had taken firm root in Egypt. A notable school flourished at Alexandria, and communities spread across Lower Egypt. The earliest surviving manuscript of the Gospels on papyrus, a fragment of John's Gospel from the 2nd century, was found in Egypt, testifying to the early strength of the faith there. By the mid-3rd century, Christians were already the majority in many regions, including Upper Egypt, despite fierce persecution under Emperor Decius. The failure of this campaign is underscored by the fact that his was the last name ever inscribed in hieroglyphs at an Egyptian temple. Tolerance followed under Gallienus, and by the early 4th century, Christianity had effectively triumphed over the old religion. The final persecution under Diocletian in 303 was brief, and soon after, hieroglyphic writing vanished entirely, replaced by Greek and Coptic. The Bible was translated into Coptic, and the old pagan literature ceased to be copied. At the end of the 3rd century, the desert east of Aphroditopolis saw the first hermit, saint, Anthony, who marked the beginning of monasticism. In 313, Constantine's Edict of Milan granted equal rights to all religions, but in practice it signaled the decline of paganism. Christians became increasingly aggressive, often attacking temples, while imperial policy moved from tolerance to restriction, and under Theodosius, Christianity was declared the sole official religion of the empire. Pagan worship was banned, temples were closed or repurposed, and mobs destroyed many shrines, despite official orders to preserve them. Yet paganism survived in scattered places. In 415, the philosopher Hypatia was murdered at Alexandria by a Christian mob, though she had enjoyed the friendship of respected churchmen. The last stronghold of the Old Faith lay at Philae, on the frontier of Nubia, where the temple of Isis remained active, protected by the Blemmyes. These Nubian tribes were devoted to Isis, and even secured treaties guaranteeing their right to worship there and borrow the goddess's statue. Pagan priests continued to leave inscriptions on the temple walls into the mid-5th century. But in the 6th century, Emperor Justinian finally closed the sanctuary, imprisoned its priests, and transferred its sacred statues to Constantinople. By then, Nubia itself had embraced Christianity, and the last vestige of the ancient Egyptian religion disappeared.